It was a flood of epic proportion,
There's nothing to ever compare to this.
creating the worst cemetery disaster in U.S. history.
We lost most of my mother's family.
Out of this horrifying devastation, extraordinary individuals came forward and undertook the amazing task of bringing final rest to the dead and closure to the living. It was called the Great Flood of '93, one of the most costly and devastating floods to ravage the United States in modern history. It flooded 17 million acres over 9 Midwestern states, causing damages totaling more than $12 billion and killing 50 people in Missouri and Illinois. The flood was months in the making, beginning with a wet fall and culminating with torrential rains in the spring. By summer, some places experienced rainfall of up to 4 to 7 inches in 1 hour. The Mississippi and Missouri rivers overflowed to record heights, forcing the evacuation of 85,000 residents. 55,000 homes were damaged or destroyed. The entire region was declared a national disaster.
I've never faced anything in my life that was as devastating as the '93 flood.
Since I've lived in Ray County, there's nothing to ever compare to this. Nothing that I've ever witnessed.
In July, area levees broke near Hardin, Missouri, causing rushing waters to flood the town's farmlands and its only cemetery. The force of the water washed out graves, dislodging vaults and caskets.
You would never think water, a resource such as water, could cause as much tragedy as it does when it gets out of control. And with the Missouri River being 8 miles south of us, we never expected that this whole situation would ever happen.
Snow doesn't realize the full extent of the disaster until he gets a call from the governor.
The governor of Missouri was flying over the flooded area when he thought a trash dumpster had turned over in the cemetery. And what he had mistaken to be a trash dumpster was actually a steel vault that had come out of the ground and was laying down in the lower section of the cemetery, had floated down there.
That sighting is the tip of the iceberg. More calls start coming in, with reports of caskets and vaults and even bodies bobbing up in the water.
The vault started popping out of the ground, and in a vault they're sealed, but there's air that's sealed inside. Well, whenever the water gets deep enough, that vault will become buoyant. And usually when you have a 1,500, 3,000 pound vault, it's going to find a way to the top.
When the floodwaters begin to recede, the full extent of the disaster is visible. Caskets, vaults, embalmed bodies, and skeletal remains are scattered over 26 square miles, an area larger than the island of Manhattan. Of the 1,665 graves originally buried in the Hardin Cemetery, nearly half are washed away.
I lost my grandma and grandpa, my mother and dad, my brother, my twin sister, and a younger sister, and an aunt and uncle. They just washed them away. They're not there no more. We lost most of my mother's family that was buried in the cemetery, her mother and dad, her paternal grandparents, a brother, and 2 sisters.
I had friends buried down there that we found one that was completely out of the coffin. down through there, and they had to recover that and put it back, and we cried.
What the people of Hardin are enduring is more than anyone could have imagined. Witnessing floating caskets was the stuff of horror movies, not real life. And to make matters worse, these caskets and vaults contained their loved ones, family and friends, children and parents, people they had already mourned and buried. Now this unbelievable tragedy ignites their grief again. Like others with deep family ties in Hardin, Ed and Linda Wolf are in shock when they realize what happened.
We lost our son Christopher, who was an infant and died at birth in 1975. We lost Ed's set of grandparents on the Wolf side, and we lost Ed's father.
You expect that when you bring a loved one to the cemetery that that's the final resting place. Well, that final resting place was null and void, you know, and that just psychologically really affected a lot of people because their loved ones not where we put them to be finally. And, you know, so it was just quite a traumatic situation.
To this day, bones are still being found.
So what kind of
Forensic anthropologist Elizabeth Murray recently visited the cemetery.
So as the water level is raising lower at the cemetery, why we keep getting calls of bones and things being washed back up on the surface. As a matter of fact, last week we had a skull wash up and was found on the edge of the lake. So I went down and retrieved it and brought it back up to the facility here.
You have it here?
Yes, ma'am.
So this was just discovered recently?
Yes, just last week.
Has small mastoid processes, fairly smooth brow. It's a relatively small skull. Not a lot of development in here where the neck muscles attach. It kind of has a female size and appearance to it, but I'm sure it'd be another one of your unknowns, wouldn't it?
Oh yes, yes. It'll be given a file folder and I'll photograph it and you know, we'll continue to hold the skull until it can be reburied down at the cemetery. But
how often has this happened that these turn up?
not very often do we get a full skull. I think we've probably only received about 4. In the summertime after the flood, when the farmers started reworking their fields for the next planting, they were discovering several long bones and a few skulls in their fields that lied east of the cemetery.
Hardin, Missouri is a small farming town 35 miles east of Kansas City and 6 miles north of the Missouri River. At the time of the '93 flood, the population was 598. Today, it's much the same. It's a tight-knit agricultural town that supports itself by farming soybeans and corn. Ed Wolf grew up here.
A lot of the people were related in some way or another. It was just a concentrated, like a big family is what it was. Someone was always there to help you, back you up, you know, help take care of you.
It was not the first time the small community of Hardin experienced a flood. In 1951, record high water levels in the region caused thousands to abandon their homes, schools, and businesses.
I was told this was worse than the '51 flood. And my mother and dad had planned for another flood, but not any worse, and had raised their home up on blocks about that high, just to be prepared for another one if it did happen. And when I drove like less than 2 blocks around the corner to my mother's house, there was no water, on the driveway. And I was told, let's get your mom's house emptied. And 16 of us emptied that house in 1 hour, everything in it. And when Mom and I walked out the front of her house, we had the water was up to our knees in 1 hour. It raised that fast. It was unbelievable.
While the waters are still high in many areas, snow, with the assistance of volunteers and the National Guard, launches small boats to round up the caskets and vaults.
There was a fence row, woven wire fence that ran north and south that was kind of the trap for a lot of the anthropology. The skulls and bones had washed that away and got hung up in that fence. But we found some bodies out of caskets that were 22, 23 miles down east.
The flood doesn't just wash over the surface of the 9-acre Hardin cemetery. It actually cuts a swath right through it, splitting the cemetery in two and creating a permanent lake 30 feet deep. As the days go by and the water pulls back, Snow's volunteers walk across acres looking for bones stuck in the mud. Others drive all-terrain vehicles, combing miles of farmland, gathering up caskets. Eventually, 30,000 acres would be covered by the search.
In Ray County, we figured we could handle 50 bodies without having any outside help. When we discovered that we were going to exceed 50 many times over, why, that's when we sent the word out.
Calls go out across the state. Additional funeral directors, anthropologists, and pathologists are desperately needed to deal with the bodies and skeletal remains.
In the Missouri Funeral Directors Association, they have a portion that's called the MFDA Disaster Response Team, and they have been trained in mass fatality disasters.
Vernie Fountain answers Dean Snow's call for help. Vernie is a funeral director and a member of the Missouri Funeral Directors Disaster Response Team. To Fountain, dealing with the displaced coffins presented many unique problems.
Some of them were broken open, so we were dealing with human remains all the way down to skeletal remains that were recovered, all the way up to some containers that would weigh as much as 4,000 pounds. And those were they're called surface mausoleums. There were 5 or 6 of those that were washed out. And of course we had to have wreckers move those. We had forklifts. First operations center was on a farm outside of Richmond. It was a small machine shed, and we began to operate actually off of a card table and a few chairs. We brought in somewhere probably around 100 vaults and or caskets. In the back room, if you will, of the machine shed is where our initial processing started. And caskets were opened. We had a team of people with a checklist, and they would check for things such as wristbands, hospital wristbands that would still be on. A suit, is there a particular lapel pin on the suit of the decedent? What's the color? Things of this nature. And if we could identify by that method, then that, of course, person was then marked as known.
Because of the sheer number of caskets, bodies, and bones, the machine shed quickly becomes overcrowded. A decision is made to move the temporary morgue to the county fairgrounds, where there would be more room to work. One recovery in particular stands out in Fountain's memory.
One of the caskets, when that casket was opened, it turned out to be a veteran. We were able to identify because of dog tags there, and the order was given immediately not to disturb that in any fashion. That was closed. Immediately we placed a flag over that, and that flag stayed over that throughout the operation.
That was a little symbolic thing that people could take a look at and say, well, we're doing some good.
Cassandra Smith.
The residents of Hardin are distraught. They demand that every effort be made to recover and identify their missing friends and family. Town officials respond. Snow explains that every effort is being made. But everyone realizes the likelihood of finding every missing body or bone is highly improbable. Ed Wolf's emotions run high. He is anxious to know whether his father and baby Christopher will be found.
It was just the day-to-day ordeal. You know, are they going to find them? Are they not going to find them? And it was just constant, constant turmoil in that there's nothing you can do about it.
Days turn into weeks, and Snow knows his crew needs even more help.
We established early on that this was going to be a very costly operation, and the President signed the bill that this was going to be a federal disaster, met the qualifications, so then we were able to ask the request of some more professional and forensic people, which the feds helped pay for, to bring them in to do the identification operation.
The federal government promised an assessment team of 5 to help the exhausted crew in Hardin. Even they didn't realize exactly what they were going to be up against. A recovery crew in Hardin, Missouri has been working for weeks to retrieve the embalmed and mummified bodies, hundreds of caskets, and thousands of bones washed away from the cemetery by the Great Midwest Flood of '93. The flood also stirred deep emotions, and Ray County Coroner Dean Snow tries his best to reassure the Hardin residents.
I had a lady whose parents had been deceased for over 30 years, and she was having nightmares every night because she didn't know where they were at. And just needing to know that they had been recovered. And, getting identified was, of course, the bigger factor, but it just psychologically affected people not knowing.
The crew gathers all the remains they can and place them in the makeshift morgue. But the task of identifying Hardin's dead becomes increasingly overwhelming. Vernie Fountain, lead coordinator for the recovery efforts, explains what came next in the operation.
We had to move into a forensic type of operation. In other words, we had to have anthropologists, dental folks, fingerprint people, x-ray technicians, and so on, to begin this, what we call processing.
Both Snow and Fountain realize their crew is still not equipped to identify the many bodies and bones. They know they need additional forensic experts and call DMORT for assistance. DMORT is short for Disaster Mortuary Operational Response Team. The team operates at the federal level, and its mandate is to help local jurisdictions manage the dead in mass disasters. The Hardin Cemetery disaster is the group's first deployment.
Had it not been for DMORT, what we would have had to have done would be to just seek out different forensic entities, individuals with the expertise, and just pick them around the country and bring them in. Strangers, this way we had a team of people that came in. They were all professionals.
Since Hardin, DMORT teams, now under the Department of Homeland Security, were activated to help identify the victims of the Oklahoma City bombing, several major air crashes, and the 9/11 attacks. Forensic anthropologist Paul Sledzik joins up with the crew in Hardin when he arrives there. He is the head of the small DMORT assessment team that is sent down to evaluate the scope of the disaster.
From the federal disaster response perspective, this was the first time the forensic anthropologists hadn't had a major role, and it makes sense because most of what we're dealing with are skeletal remains.
Sledzik is well aware that how we as a society treat the dead goes beyond our feelings for our loved ones.
I think that historically in America, we've always placed a high price on our dead, whether it be from wars or from our own families. And I think particularly at Hardin, people felt a connection to this cemetery. This was the only history that the town had. And the town had essentially been wiped out by the floods itself, and then to have its history wiped out as well, I think was kind of a double whammy for them.
In addition to Sledzik, the assembled crew includes 3 funeral directors and a mortuary search and recovery expert from the Department of Defense. At the time of the Hardin Cemetery disaster, Sledzik was a curator at the National Museum of Health and Medicine.
Center. This is very similar to a lot of the embalmed remains we saw at Hardin. This is a head and upper torso of a young girl that was embalmed in Kentucky in the late 1800s using an arsenic method. But the shape and the consistency of this particular specimen is very similar to those we were seeing at the Hardin Cemetery. This cemetery goes back to the Civil War, right up to the present time. So you had almost 800 burials in this cemetery that represented that particular time period.
The people in Hardin's oldest graves were most likely not embalmed and were buried in wooden caskets, so these bodies would have decomposed long ago. The practice of embalming only became widespread after the Civil War, when huge numbers of dead needed to be preserved so they could be shipped home. Because the National Museum of Health and Medicine is also a research facility, they were permitted to keep some of the unidentified bones from Hardin.
In this cabinet here, we've got some of the skeletal material from Hardin. Some of the long bones, different bones. But let's take it over on the other table. When the floodwaters hit this cemetery, these got washed out into the 25 square miles worth of farmland. We've got some vertebral osteoarthritis and fusion going on there.
You can see it on either side here.
Right, the bony bridging there. This is a dislocated shoulder. This is the scapula, the shoulder blade.
Yeah, that's so polished there from the wear.
Right, and that's right, you got the bone-on-bone eburnation. And that's just very severe. All the cartilage was destroyed.
This shiny surface shows us this person was using their arm, and that's what puts the shine on there, because bone is rubbing on bone in an abnormal way.
Exactly.
The DMORT group works to determine the total number of skeletal remains, and therefore the number of people they are dealing with.
Or for the individual bones, what we would do is divide them by the bone, whether it's the humerus, the upper arm bone, or the femur, the upper leg bone, and then divide them by side, left versus right, and then seriate them. We'd put the largest bones towards the center of a long table, and then make them smaller as we went out from that central point, and then count them all, get an idea of how many people were represented by all these individual elements.
In anthropology, we call that the minimum number of individuals.
Sledzik says that if a skull is reasonably intact, it's counted as one individual. Partial skulls, however, could simply have resulted from breakage. The skull count produces a minimum of 129 people, represented now only by bones.
We would come to work every morning. There'd be a couple boxes full of bones that the search teams had brought in. We'd start to clean them off, and then we'd divide them by skeletal elements. We would have all the humeri on one set of tables, all the femora, the upper leg bones on another set of tables.
After cleaning and sorting the bones by body side and then by size, Paul and his crew use standard forensic anthropology procedures, beginning with the measurement of each bone. In adult remains, measurements can help separate males and females. Measuring the bones from children can provide an estimate of how old the child was when he or she died, but cannot sort boys from girls.
What we'll do is take the long bone, this is a humerus, the upper arm bone, and we measure the length of it. This is about 124 millimeters long. And we take that measurement and we compare it to a set of standards that were developed on known age children with the same bone measurement. So by doing that, we're able to determine how old this child is at the time of their death.
In addition to estimations of sex and age, specific bones can often provide more information that can help individualize or identify a set of remains, like baby Christopher.
That we had from Hardin. Well, to determine sex, we would look at the pelvic bones, which is our standard method of doing it. To determine race, we would look at the skull. We knew in this particular cemetery that they were all Caucasian based on the records that we were able to find. We'd look at all the bones for pathological conditions, gunshot wounds, healed fractures, things like that.
Even with the combined efforts of Verney Fountain and Dean Snow's volunteers and Sledzik assessment team from Washington, the progress of trying to identify individuals from this many bones and bodies looks like it could take months. Sledzik calls Washington for additional help. In mid-October, nearly 4 months after the cemetery washed out, a group of close to 50, including forensic anthropologists, dentists, pathologists, FBI fingerprint experts, and support personnel join up with the crew in Hardin. The recovery efforts collected approximately 3,400 bones and 408 individuals who were represented by a complete set of remains. Now the people of Hardin wanted to know how soon it would be until the bodies that were found could be identified and returned to them again. It was almost 4 months since the Midwest flood washed away Hardin's historic cemetery. This was a flood for the record books. 95,000 people from 9 Midwestern states were in dire need of help. In Illinois and Missouri, 8,000 property owners sold out and moved to higher ground. The painstaking process of trying to identify the thousands of skeletal remains and hundreds of individuals recovered from the washed-out Hardin Cemetery was still going on. It was now in the capable hands of a special crew of experts who knew how to deal with the dead. The psychological impact caused by the flood's devastation continues to take its toll on the residents of Hardin. Psychologists are finding people filled with anxiety and depression and a sense of helplessness. For Linda Renison, waiting for word about lost family members, including her mother's parents, her brothers, and her sisters, is unsettling. And she feels this catastrophe was so traumatic for her mother that it hastened her death.
My mother had just retired the year before in '92. She was 71 years old when she retired from a garment factory that she had worked in. And she was doing fairly well till this all happened. And then she just kind of closed down as far as being interested in anything. It just wore on her mind so bad that it was just a matter of 3 or 4 years and she was in a nursing home. And from then on, she never spoke, never said nothing.
Linda's aunt, Dot Bacchus, relies on her faith while she waits.
I think it's in God's hand. You know, it was just one of those things. So I just live with it.
Ed Wolf feels the anxiety and frustration of many in the town.
You know, have they found anybody? Have they located anyone? Is it, you know, mom's husband, you know, my dad? Is it our baby? You know, it's just a constant thing.
Coroner Dean Snow knows how important it is to keep the lines of communication open.
The main thing that we could do was to keep them informed daily of what was going on here at the cemetery. We'd set up a family assistance center out at the fairgrounds, which people came daily, and we tried to give a update twice a day of letting them know what was going on and if we'd made any identifications, who had been identified.
For the crew in Hardin, the process of identification is extremely complicated. Because the victims of this disaster are already dead, and some of them over 100 years, medical records usually helpful in identifications are not to be found.
This is a picture of my
The
mother.
crew has to come up with other kinds of data to compare with their observations of the bodies. One of the first things they do is ask relatives of the displaced dead for photos. They also ask them if they can recall information about the clothing or any personal property buried with their loved ones. This type of information could help in assigning a presumptive or temporary ID. Linda and Ed Wolf's infant son, Christopher, had been buried for 18 years before the flood.
They asked if we had any pictures at all to bring those. Well, I knew exactly what he was buried in, so that wasn't a problem for me at all, because he was buried in his yellow bunny suit. This little sleeper that was given to him at a baby shower. And I had pictures to prove that. But everyone went through the same process, you know, as far as remembering back what, you know, they could.
Making a positive ID requires matching specific and personal features like fingerprints, DNA, or unique traits in the skeleton with existing records or other known data. Relatives bring whatever medical or personal records they have to the Family Assistance Center. No one really knows what information will ultimately be helpful in making either a presumptive or positive ID.
The end of the fourth rib, just like you were saying. Those are the two methods.
Paul Sledzik, who came to Hardin with the Special Disaster Mortuary Response Team from Washington, explains the crew's process for collecting information.
Families would come in with either the medical records of their loved ones if they were deceased recently, or the recollections of what their loved ones' pathological conditions were like. And they'd list them on a form, we'd copy those down, we'd put them in a database. So when we got a particular unique feature on the body, we could search the database for that unique feature.
Now, how accurate do you think the medical records versus the recollections were?
Well, I recall a few cases talking to the coroner that the families would come in and claim that, let's say, their aunt had a healed fracture of her right hip, and then the husband would argue and say, no, it was the left hip. So there was a bit of ambiguity there. So that's why we were looking for things that were very, very unique, things like glass eyes, things like even the personal effects we used quite a bit.
But that would have to be contained within the coffin. Did you have a lot of personal effects that were strewn about the flood site?
There weren't many that were recovered. Most of the personal effects that we used were inside the casket, right? So they were contained with the body. They didn't get out. They weren't pushed up against another casket or anything like that.
The DMOR team soon realizes that in most cases, finding medical records or relatives with useful information is going to be next to impossible. But sometimes a little detective work yields results.
We had a young female skeletal remains that had an infant. And the anthropologist discovered that the woman's pelvic area was not as such that she would have been able to give natural birth to this child.
The anthropologist working with the crew said the bones showed that the woman probably had the child by cesarean section, and that the child died either at birth or shortly after.
It's probably one of the early burials in the cemetery, but we just kept following up on tidbits of information, and we used to have 2 or 3 of the older ladies in the area and the older men, and we'd go to them and ask them questions. Do you remember such and such or so and so? And, oh, well, you know, now let's see, now so and so had a daughter that, yeah, by golly, she did. You become pregnant, and yeah, she died right at childbirth. And I think that did a cesarean section, you know.
What are their names, please?
Memories help in the identification process, but ultimately, the information the bones can offer is more reliable.
Over the years, anthropologists have learned that we can fine-tune, or at least attempt to fine-tune, some age ranges from some pretty unusual places in the skeleton.
Right, and we actually used that in Hardin. When we had mummified bodies or bodies that were partially decomposed, we did a cut down on the pelvic area to look at that pubic symphysis, and we do a cut down on the chest to look at the end of the fourth rib, just like you were saying. Those are the 2 methods that we've used for years and years and years, and they still held up here.
Mm-hmm.
Forensic anthropologists at Hardin create reports for the 32 individuals who have flesh remaining on their bones, many of whom are mummified. The reports include the approximate age at death, sex, estimated height, and probable ancestry. They also note any unique biological features and observable traumas, like broken bones. They also note how the person was placed in the casket, and what they were wearing, and any artifacts included with them, like jewelry, eyeglasses, or dentures.
What do we have here, Paul? Can you tell us about this?
This is one of the cases of metastatic carcinoma that we had from Hardin. It's really remarkable. This is one of the pelvic bones. And just for comparison, here's a normal, and you can see all the punched out lesions there. What's incredible about the cases that we had a metastatic carcinoma from Hardin is that every bone in the body was affected.
So this is cancer, and you can tell it's cancer, not just breakage from the flood or anything like that.
Right, it's very distinctive. You have these kind of eaten away areas, these round circular holes. The fact in these particular cases, the majority of the damage was in the pelvic area. We think it might be something like ovarian cancer. And these are cases from the 1920s, 1930s, so before the modern treatment techniques.
But it isn't just the bones, medical records, and family memories that help the forensic anthropologists identify the deceased. The caskets the dead are buried in also hold surprising clues. For weeks, the Hardin Cemetery disaster crew compiles profiles of the dead based on information from family or friends. Their hope is to match this information with data gathered from studying the recovered remains.
And then you get any identifying marks.
This is what you really need.
Exactly.
Like many of the town's residents, the Wolfs go to the Family Assistance Center daily to see if their loved ones, including their missing baby, had been found and identified.
He's not on this one.
They had a list posted who was found and who wasn't, if the caskets were marked or not, and if the name tag had come off of the caskets.
Although more than 200 caskets are retrieved from the 769 washed out graves, many have no name tags. But even without them, the caskets can still offer important information that might eventually help identify who was buried in them. Like cars or fashion, casket models have changed throughout the decades to appeal to prevailing tastes. Funeral director Vernie Fountain knows that if they can identify the caskets by model years, they can possibly connect the remains with information given by relatives.
If we can establish that, for lack of a better term, the make and the model, maybe the manufacturer, a little bit of the design, things like this might eliminate certain folks. In other words, John Doe perhaps died a certain date. Well, if this casket happened to be only made, after that date or something, it was obviously not John Doe. So it helped us with the process of elimination.
According to Paul Sledzik, the lead forensic anthropologist, the age of a casket doesn't necessarily correlate to the state of the remains found inside.
We had a few caskets, cast iron caskets, that dated to the late 1800s, early 1900s, that we actually had to blowtorch open because they were airtight seals. Mm-hmm. And when we broke those open and took the remains out for analysis, they were very well preserved. A lot of soft tissue preservation. Some of the soft tissues were still soft. Very to the point where almost like human skin. So that was pretty remarkable to have stuff that old to be that well preserved.
I guess you can't exactly keep people.
Besides being the county coroner, Dean Snow is a funeral director. He had hoped that many of the caskets would contain memorial records about the deceased in a glass or metal tube that comes with many caskets.
Hey, Elizabeth, one of the things that the casket manufacturers started over 30-some years ago is they started incorporating an information sheet in a casket, which was this little piece of parchment with all the historical data of the deceased individual, and then this paper was all rolled up and placed in this little tube and then put back in the casket.
But Snow says they did not have the luxury of that information. There was a problem. When many of the tubes were checked, the paper rolled up in them had never been filled out. Every displaced casket found is opened in order to identify the remains inside. The condition of the individual determines which scientist performs the examination. Forensic pathologists examine well-preserved bodies. Anthropologists analyze the less well-preserved, the mummified or skeletonized remains. Of the 769 graves washed out by the flood, the crew in Hardin is able to positively identify 119 individuals. 145 graves are classified as black line. All that remains are dark lines in the soil 4 to 6 inches thick. Their contents disintegrated beyond any known means of identification. 486 remains are marked unknown. Of these, 40 are children.
They never found the relatives from the cemetery or identified them. They found remains, but we don't know that they were our remains of our family. My mother, she just took it badly. It haunted her. I think it was probably the end of her, is that her family was gone. They're not there no more. There's nothing to show that they were ever there, only my pictures.
Perhaps it is just luck, or the land finally drying out. But alongside a road that had been repeatedly searched, a child's casket is spotted.
We were eating supper one evening in October, and the coroner called Dean Snow, and he said that they had found Christopher's casket along the road down by Little Brick Schoolhouse.
You found it?
He was the only one found in the family, and that everything was intact, you know, the casket and the vault and everything. He still had his name on it and everything. It was relief that he was found.
As winter approaches, the residents of Hardin are finally ready to put some measure of closure on their grief by reburying their dead. But first, they have the daunting task of rebuilding their cemetery. Four months after the Great Midwest Flood devastated Hardin, Missouri, the townspeople are ready to rebuild their historic cemetery and rebury their loved ones. Hundreds of new graves are needed. Some will carry a name once again. Others will simply be marked unknown. The middle of the cemetery is now scarred by a permanent lake that will forever remind residents of the flood's destruction. To make room for 480 new grave sites, the town purchases a cornfield adjacent to the old cemetery and bulldozes a 24,000 square foot area.
Human remains are placed in it. We did it much differently.
Bernie Fountain, the lead coordinator for the disaster recovery efforts, worked on mapping out the burial plots.
And we laid out 480 grave sites. This particular area here that's white, this was left vacant so that it would enable us to later inter additional human remains should they be found. And in fact, they were found. And eventually an additional 22 human remains were buried in this little white section down here. This pink section down here that you see is rather small, but this is all the infant graves that were unidentified. We wanted the operation to be much different than the common thought of what a mass grave is. These are individual grave sites. It just happens to be that we opened up one huge area in order to do it.
New vaults are arranged with identifying numbers. The numbers can be matched to the new post-mortem records created during the recovery and analysis process. This ensures that any future evidence recovered is used to identify someone recorded as unknown. The 119 individuals positively identified are placed in one section of the cemetery with new headstones. The 486 sets of remains that couldn't be identified are placed in graves marked unknown. On a cold day that December, nearly half a year after the flood, the town holds its memorial service.
I cried through the memorial service, as did many people who worked there and put a lot of sweat into this thing. Very impressive. We, as a team that morning, went out to each unknown grave site and put one red rose on each unknown grave and one white rose on each infant grave.
Linda Wolf, who was unable to attend the first burial of her infant son, is now by her husband Ed's side.
And I remember we were there at the time designated for Christopher's burial. And of course, when you're at the cemetery, you can look up the road. And I was just constantly looking, you know, is that one Christopher? Is that truck coming? Is that Christopher, you know? And then when I looked up and I saw the wrecker with one small casket in it, then I knew that was Christopher. And sure enough, it came over and parked just a short distance of the place that was designated, you know, to rebury him. And the belts were put around the casket and it's picked up and just kind of dropped in home. So when the casket was lowered down, you know, you say a prayer, you say a few words, and you turn around and you leave.
Today, life in Hardin has pretty much returned to normal.
I just live with it. Because life goes on. You have to. You just have to.
As far as myself, I think that I've accepted it.
As for the crew that helped the town survive this tragedy and move on, there is a sense of pride.
I think for the people of Hardin, they just wanted an effort made. They didn't want this to be treated as a bunch of dead people, put them in a big hole in the ground and walk away. They wanted an effort made, and we were the professionals that were able to go in and provide that service for them.
The cemetery is a library of history, and I'll always remember that. When I visit the cemetery now, I think of all the history that was there, and hopefully a big portion of that has been returned there by the efforts of our team.
Well, I think one of the best things that came from the disaster as far as the mortuary and funeral homes goes is that the state enacted that each body buried would be buried with a identification band either attached to an ankle or to a wrist. You know, nobody wants to ever have this happen again. But if it should happen again, why, at least identification should be a lot easier and a lot faster.
Two years after the flood, the cemetery is rededicated, and a granite monument is erected with the words, "Lest we forget." Death is supposed to be the final chapter in our lives. But in Hardin, Missouri, the forces of nature conspired to rewrite the book. The dedicated work of the scientists who helped identify and rebury the dead in dignity brought a measure of closure and peace to the living. The voices of the dead echo throughout a centuries-old music hall in Cincinnati, Ohio. Workers discover a crypt filled with skeletons, and the secrets of 1,000 bones are unleashed. When the dead are disturbed, anthropologists turn to science to restore peace to the living and put to rest the ghosts of the past. In Cincinnati, Ohio, while working in one of the elevator shafts of the old music hall, the floor suddenly gives way under a pounding jackhammer. Reaching into the soil, a worker pulls out a human skull.
Don't do anything. I'm gonna go get somebody.
The crew halts their work, and a music hall official is summoned.
What'd you guys find? We were busting a hole in the slab.
Carefully feeling around the broken-up floor, the workers find more skulls.
Don't touch anything. I'll call the police. Stay here.
Before long, hundreds of bones are exposed from this hidden crypt. The story dominates the local news. TV and newspaper accounts reveal rumors that Music Hall was built on the grounds of an old potter's field or public cemetery, and that this was not the first time that skeletons had emerged from a so-called resting place at this site. The bones are taken to the Hamilton County Morgue for examination. The Hamilton County Coroner's Office typically receives only a small number of skeletal remains per year. This was an exceptional amount. It was soon obvious that the services of a professional anthropology team would be needed to document and analyze the bones. Dr. Anthony Przigian is called in to provide his expertise.
Well, as a consultant for the coroner's office, I was asked to come in and examine the materials and determine whether or not it constituted a crime scene, to do a standard investigation, identification of the remains.
Nearly 88 pounds of them, and that they seem very old. It also appears that this jumble of bones, over 2,500 separate bones and fragments, does not represent a crime. When the bones are discovered, Elizabeth Murray is a graduate student in anthropology, and Dr. Przigian is her advisor. He encourages her to take the lead in the investigation.
Well, obviously, the first thing you have to establish is that this is not a forensic matter. You know, this is not something that we need to involve law enforcement in. We don't need to investigate this from any criminal point of view. So then it becomes a research project. It becomes a mission, if you will, to explore who these people were, why they came to be there.
But to figure out who these people were and why they came to be unceremoniously dumped beneath the basement of such a grand old building would require a detailed investigation.
I was personally very interested in finding out how these bones came to be in the basement of this elevator shaft, and no one seemed to know about it. This wasn't a graveyard. This was a cement tomb that had been intentionally made, and a group of people had been tossed haphazardly into this cement tomb. The initial interest on my part was, how did this come to be here, and how has it been lost to Cincinnati's history?
These bones were most likely early Cincinnati citizens, and this investigation could give them a voice again. Dr. Murray begins her investigation at Music Hall, where she meets with Robert Howes. Howes is a violinist with a passion for music and history. He's also the official archivist of Music Hall.
I'm sure that you have things that I'm not aware of, or at least I would assume so. So I think it'd be a nice opportunity for us to, take a second look at the documentation from that time. It's an amazing structure. Has it always looked like this?
No, actually, what we see today is due to 1895-96 renovation, really a complete redesign of the auditorium. Because it was originally just one long room with a flat floor. This is a raked floor, a nice theater floor. And also didn't have a stage, it didn't have an orchestra pit.
Music Hall was dedicated in 1878 and built for a little under $500,000. It was designed in high Victorian Revival Gothic style and was to accommodate two main functions: the center building for musical events and its wings for exhibitions and conventions. Since its construction, the building has undergone more than a dozen renovations, totaling upward of $12 million.
Okay, well, let me show you the freight elevator.
So this is where it happened.
That's right.
Seeing the freight elevator shaft does reinforce one thing for Murray. It's an odd place to find a crypt of bones. Much of the history of Music Hall and Cincinnati is stored at the Cincinnati Historical Society. Howes is very familiar with its collections of documents and deeds. One set of maps in particular proves to be a gold mine, rich in clues about the original use of the Music Hall property, which Murray hopes will verify if the land really was once the location of a potter's field.
Yes, exactly.
You've seen the early 1800s maps, haven't you?
Yes, I have. There's one in particular that I think we should take a look at. It's a 1819 map.
Oh, the Farnsworth map.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's what it is.
Great.
Well, let's see if we can find it here. These are the map drawers.
Yeah.
Let's try this one.
Ah, there it is.
Yep, this is the Farnsworth map.
Yeah, public burying ground.
The Farnsworth map provides some proof that the old stories about Music Hall were true. The map clearly shows that there was a public burial ground between lots 52 and 54. Lot 53 is where Music Hall stands today. This grand old Cincinnati landmark was built right on top of a potter's field, where hundreds of poor and unknown deceased were laid to rest. This is a critical clue, as it provides the first piece of evidence that connects bones to the property. But this information still doesn't explain why workers found bones in the floor of the elevator shaft. Additional records in the archive reveal more specific information about the history of this parcel of land. City health records show that throughout the early 1800s, thousands died in Cincinnati during a series of cholera epidemics. When disease orphaned hundreds of children, the city reclaimed the potter's field and built an orphanage on the property. This was the first major structure built on this land. The Orphans Asylum gave shelter to children for several decades before moving to another location. Further records indicate that the old orphanage building on Lot 53 temporarily housed Civil War soldiers. In 1870, the construction of Sangerfest Hall, Cincinnati's first public exhibition and performance space, transformed the old orphanage site. But Sangerfest Hall had a very short life.
Sangerfest Hall didn't last on that property too long because it had a tin roof. And what they quickly found out was you can't have a music festival in a rainstorm when you have a tin roof.
Sangerfest Hall is demolished just a few years after it is built, and plans are quickly made for a new and improved music hall to take its place. By late 1876, ground is broken for the new music hall, which, like its predecessor, is situated along the banks of the Miami-Erie Canal that connects the Ohio River to the Great Lakes.
Now this one also shows the canal, right?
Yes, a canal was put in, I believe, around 1823, and that had something to do with choosing or maintaining an interest in that lot, because the canal would allow convenient access to Music Hall with various large items that would be used in an exhibition.
The archives are also the repository for old Cincinnati newspapers, the media record of their day. An article from 1876 catches her attention with its vivid details about the groundbreaking for Music Hall. The story in the Sunday edition of the Cincinnati commercial newspaper describes the unruly antics of a gathering mob when word gets out that skeletons are surfacing from the ground of the old and nearly forgotten Potter's Field. The reporter writes,
"The crowds watch each new discovery with ghoulish interest. Bone after bone, as soon as thrown out, is turned over with a scientific application of kicks. Dirty fingers are poked into empty eye sockets. Jawbones are experimentally hammered with heavy canes. Poor ghost. And by night, there come medical students to steal the poor skulls."
According to Howes, the discovery of these bones was an embarrassment to city officials, who, when asked by the public if the bones were a health risk, said they had no authority over the situation. Murray had great hopes that these bones were the ones found in the basement floor of Music Hall.
Now, one would initially assume, okay, that explains why these bones, came to be in this elevator shaft, but that's not the case. There was a gentleman on the board of directors for Music Hall who was also on the board of directors for a very beautiful and famous old cemetery here in town called Spring Grove Cemetery. And because this gentleman was on the board at both, he arranged for the remains to be relocated in Spring Grove Cemetery.
So, shortly after their discovery, several wagon loads of bones are brought to Spring Grove and buried in an unmarked plot near the tiny graves of a group of children, some of whom may have come from the old orphans asylum. It looked as if Murray had run into a dead end about solving the mystery of where the Music Hall bones had come from, or who these people might have been. But the more she thought about the rumor being true, that the building was built on top of a cemetery, the more she wondered if there was any truth to it being haunted. John Engst was a night watchman who for many years worked the late shift at Music Hall. After all his late-night journeys through the building, he had no doubts that the restless spirits of the Potter's Field dead wandered its halls. Following ghosts might be a rather unorthodox way to gather information about who buried the bones under Music Hall. But as it turns out, they provide some pretty solid leads that begin to reveal the secrets of the Music Hall bones. A stone crypt filled with human bones was discovered by construction workers at the Cincinnati, Ohio Music Hall. Robert Howes and Dr. Elizabeth Murray uncovered important evidence that Music Hall was constructed on land once used as a public burial ground. Unfortunately, this information did not provide the answer as to why the crypt of bones was found over 100 years later in the floor of an elevator shaft. But now Dr. Murray had a new lead.
In researching the archives of Music Hall, I met a number of interesting people, but the most colorful was the old night watchman.
John Engst was a night watchman at Music Hall when the bones were discovered.
This is a guy that had worked at Music Hall for 20 years or more and used to go around the building at night with his flashlight and keys, making sure the building was secure. And he swore that the building was haunted. He recalled that every time he went near that elevator shaft, his hair stood on end. And he had told people that he was sure the building was haunted. He was there the night the bones were discovered. And in fact, he said that he was leaning over the shoulders of the construction crew because he knew the bones were down in that elevator shaft. And as soon as they punched through, they realized it wasn't solid down there, but it was a hollow space. And the night watchman said, stick your hand down in there. And the guy said, I'm gonna stick my hand down there. And he said, go on, stick your hand down there. And when he did, he said he pulled up a human skull. And the night watchman said that was the closest thing to a religious experience he had had. He really believed that there was something more to music hall than met the eye. And, you know, I wouldn't question the guy who walked around there at night for 20 years. Certainly, if music hall had its ghosts, the night watchman would be the person to know about it.
John was not the first music hall caretaker to go on the record saying this building was haunted. The same 1876 newspaper story that reported the accidental discovery of skeletons during music hall's construction also told about another night watchman's report of ghosts on his watch.
The night watchman in charge of the building was greatly annoyed by mysterious sounds whenever he went within the building. By night, the sound of stealthy footsteps followed him. When he stopped, they ceased, and there were strange knocking sounds at all hours of the night. And sometimes sounds of mocking laughter broke the silence. Sometimes strange whispers.
Were these stories a night watchman's hoax or reports from true believers? Murray wonders if there were more ghostly tales, so she continues to look through the old newspapers. Nearly 50 years after the first article, she notices another from the Daily Times Star.
In 1927, they were ready to celebrate the Golden Jubilee of this building, the big 50th anniversary celebration. And so they were doing a lot of modernization of the building at that time.
There it was. The ghosts had led her to another report of bones once again disturbed from graves in the old Potter's Field. The writer wrote,
digging a deep, broad trench under the south wing of Music Hall, which is now being rebuilt, workmen discovered a valley of death. They discovered 65 graves and unearthed a large quantity of human bones.
And then, a few lines further down the page, she found exactly what she'd been looking for.
If it is agreeable to the city officials, I will provide a coffin and arrange to have all the bones buried again in a single grave in the same resting place where they have reposed for probably a century or more.
According to the paper, the Music Hall Association had agreed that the construction company would rebury the remains in a single cement tomb in the basement of the building. At last, there was proof of how and why the bones were buried underneath Music Hall. It was apparently a convenient solution to reinterring some very lost souls. Now Dr. Murray was ready to pursue the next major part of the Music Hall bones mystery, figuring out who these people were, how many of them were buried together, and what their bones could tell her about their lives and perhaps their deaths.
The bones that came out of Music Hall were extremely fragmented. They had been, you think about it, they were buried in the early 1800s. A construction project happened on that ground in the late 1800s. These bones were somehow left behind and then discovered in 1927. And in that process, you know, nature as well as human construction, modern construction, were taking its toll on those bones. So you see a lot of fragmentation, a lot of old breaks.
Her first task sounded simple enough until she looked hard at what was an enormous pile of mixed up bones. She needed to sort the collection bone by bone, right sides from left, which results in grouping all the bones by regions of the body. The collection was hopelessly jumbled and had many bones either missing or damaged. The sorting showed that the larger and sturdier a bone was, the more frequently it would appear in the sample. The smaller bones of the body, those of the fingers, for example, were totally absent. It was clear that each time these skeletons were moved, only the larger bones had survived unscathed. Or more likely, Murray concluded, that the recovery of the bones at the construction sites had been quick and haphazard. Murray could not reconstruct a single complete skeleton, so she had to study the collection as a group or population, rather than being able to study individuals.
The major questions that we always encounter in a collection like this is what's the minimum number of individuals, how many people were there, and then secondly, separate out adults from children, and then beyond that, study the adults for indicators of age, of sex, of stature, anything like that that we can look at.
The bones of the pelvis are critical in helping to establish sex. As a result of puberty, the female pelvis grows wider from side to side and deeper from front to back to allow for childbirth. Females typically have smaller joint surfaces than males.
Here, we can see a small socket for the hip in the female. In the male, we can see a large hip socket, but in this female, it's clear she had a reproductive history. If we look at this aspect where ligaments attach, we actually see a pregnancy scar. Ligaments attach here to the pelvis, and the stresses of pregnancy pull and create this deep depression or scar that indicates that she had a reproductive history.
Murray is also curious about the average height of these individuals, and as an anthropologist knows that measurements from specific bones help estimate how tall a person was.
Any of the bones that are longer than they are wide in the body will give some indicator of height. Now, some of those bones relate more directly to height than others. And in this case, because there were so many represented, I chose the femur as the bone to estimate height.
Information interpreted from the bones is beginning to create a snapshot of people who lived over 100 years ago.
You know, many people say, oh, our ancestors were so short, or modern people are so much taller than they were in the past. The average height for the women in the music hall collection was 5'2", and the average height for males was 5'7". Now, when you look at worldwide statures, that's not so far off the mark from today.
Although she analyzed the bones as a group, there were times when she couldn't help noticing a few striking individuals.
You see the delicate facial features and the smooth forehead. Clearly this was a lovely young woman. Her wisdom teeth are just now erupting. She may have been 18 years old. And I say to myself, you know, how did someone like this wind up in a potter's field in Cincinnati? Did she have no one to take care of her?
Teeth not only help assess the age of an individual, but they also reveal things about a person's dental health before they died.
You see some people with really nice teeth, just like you would today, but then you also see people that have some significant dental problems that would be easily remedied today. You see people with extensive cavities and abscesses, very painful conditions for which there was probably little or no treatment. These teeth are very badly worn. You can see the top of the tooth is worn off, and you can see some severe cavity in this location.
Dental practitioners existed in Cincinnati during the 1800s, but only people with financial means would have seen one to have a tooth pulled, to take care of a painful cavity, or have a denture made. Murray did not observe any fillings or other examples of dental work. In all likelihood, she believes, these people were too poor to have anyone attend to their dental problems.
These teeth that you see missing here, these were lost after death. You can see that because the sockets are still there, the sockets are empty.
When a tooth is lost before death, whether by accident or extraction, over time the tooth socket and bone heals over, creating a noticeable gap in the gum line.
In this case, the teeth are in very good shape. This person had little tooth wear, they had no cavities. This person had relatively healthy teeth.
In a time when little was known about preventative dental care, the reason for this person's healthy teeth, Murray feels, could simply be they were born with better genetics, or possibly ate a diet that promoted better dental health. Skulls can also tell a lot about an individual. Some features can suggest whether a person was a man or a woman. Most female skulls have smooth foreheads and delicate landmarks, while the male features are usually more exaggerated.
You can see, for example, in this skull, which is clearly male, you've got this very robust brow ridge, a big brooding kind of a forehead on this individual. I think this is my favorite skull in the collection because you get this sense of a dark brooding face, coarse features, someone that, you know, I could imagine working on a canal boat in downtown Cincinnati. As you look at the bones, you sort of imagine the stories that go along with it. You go for the stories behind the bones. You look for the history because that puts it into the context. So in reading about early Cincinnati and being a Cincinnatian myself, knowing some of the history here, you kind of place these people in the settings that are familiar to you. You know, a canal boat on the Ohio River, or someone that was a seamstress in a factory downtown. Puts a face on the bones.
Murray's research showed that the music hall skeleton collection represented at least 30 and possibly as many as 70 adult individuals. 2/3 of them were most likely men. Was it only an accident that the graves of more men than women were uncovered when workers remodeled Music Hall in 1927? Or were more men originally buried in the Potter's Field in the 1800s? What other secrets were held within the Music Hall bones? Why human bones had been discovered by construction workers in the Cincinnati Music Hall's elevator shaft was no longer a great mystery. With some dogged detective work, Dr. Elizabeth Murray discovered the bones were unceremoniously buried there after being accidentally dug up when the building was remodeled in 1927. But what was still puzzling to her was why there were more men found in this collection than women. These bones had more to say.
I think we all have this Halloween notion of the skeleton being something very static. It's just, you know, like one size fits all. But to an anthropologist, you know, no two skulls are alike. No two people are alike. And we accept that when we look at people's facial features. We accept that when we know their personalities. But to an anthropologist, we accept that about the skeleton as well.
The disproportionate number of men in this sample sent her back to research additional historical records, including census data from the early 1800s. She wanted to know if there were more men than women living in Cincinnati at that time, or if there were reasons why men were more likely than women to wind up in a public burial ground.
Oh, definitely a major industry.
Dan Hurley is a historian and TV journalist in Cincinnati. He has spent years studying the city and its residents, both past and present. Murray met with Hurley at the Cincinnati Historical Society. She hoped he would have insight as to why more men than women were found in the Music Hall skeleton collection.
In the earliest years, Cincinnati was just a scruffy river town with a lot of promise, but it very quickly became the center of tremendous growth.
Cincinnati was at the western edge of the American frontier, so it was a great way station for American immigrants moving westward. By 1828, it was often referred to as the Queen City of the West.
You could even call it the first boom town in the United States after the founding of the United States as an independent nation. This is the first place that really takes off. The West is opened up, it's on this navigable river, and literally thousands of people are pouring into this place. From about 1835 till about 1855, all sorts of people came. Families came. Men came by themselves. Some women came by themselves. In all frontier or close to frontier societies, men tend to predominate. There tend to be more men because they can strike out on their own, establish a foothold, and then send for their families later on. So there's a tendency for a higher percentage of men in the population than there is for women or established families. But all of those people were here. People of all backgrounds and all descriptions were here.
Hurley's explanation about why there were more men in the population in this mid-1800s frontier town makes sense to Dr. Murray. And she has her own thoughts about why they may have ended up in the cemetery for the poor and unknown.
I imagine young men coming to establish themselves and possibly begin to save up and send for their families back east. This notion of go west, young man. Many times, if something unfortunate happened and you weren't established and you didn't have family, you might be the kind of person that would wind up in a potter's field. So for these men, maybe they were never reunited with their families back east.
The average life expectancy of these Cincinnatians and the health factors that contributed to it were not the same as they are today.
From a 21st century perspective, the key difference between us and them is the reduction of infant mortality. Beyond that, what we can say is that if you survive the first 5 years, your chances of living a relatively long life, or maybe even a very long life, were fairly good, except for this. Death was part of everyday life. People were healthy one day and they died the next day. And that was part of reality. You gotta remember, our whole medical model of illness simply didn't exist in the 19th century.
Life in the 1800s may have been unpredictable, but the expansion of the western part of the U.S. was unstoppable, and Cincinnati was a major destination. Tens of thousands of people from Western and Eastern Europe flooded in from the Northeast. And from the South came newly freed slaves looking to establish a home in the free state of Ohio. Different bones of the skeleton often suggest a person's ancestry. By looking at the skulls of the music hall collection, Dr. Murray was able to identify features of both European and African Americans.
Someone of African ancestry might have this, what we call a guttered nasal sill on the nasal region, where the nose is formed here, and also might have this kind of projection of the upper jaw. That would indicate somebody possibly of African ancestry.
People of European ancestry would have sharper nasal features, as well as a flatter upper jaw. Murray's observations of the bones told her that as many as 40 to 60% of the people in the music hall sample could have been of African ancestry. This was much higher than she expected, especially based on Cincinnati census data from that period of time. The collection of bones was turning out to be a diverse group of 19th century individuals, both in sex and ancestry. But the latest findings, this high percentage of African American bones, was perplexing, and Dr. Murray hoped history could explain the reason for this latest twist in the story of the music hall bones. The mysterious collection of bones from beneath Cincinnati's music hall was telling many of its secrets. Between 30 and 70 adults were buried in this old potter's field. 3/4 of them were male, and as many as 60% could have been of African ancestry. A much higher percentage than reflected in census data from that period.
There are several theories that could explain the disproportionately high number of African Americans probably represented in the music hall sample. One is that, unfortunately, in cemeteries, historically, people were segregated in death as well as in life. And it may be the particular area where individuals of African ancestry were buried. Secondly, it could reflect social times, in that it's possible that the Potter's Field was the place of burial for individuals of African descent. Christian cemeteries located nearby may have not socially accepted blacks being buried in them.
Dan Hurley has studied the life of African Americans living in Cincinnati in the late 1800s.
Cincinnati sits right on the Ohio River. The Ohio River was the dividing line between slavery and freedom, or at least between the slave states and the technically free states. So that this was a place for people to come initially if they were coming out of slavery. And many, many people who came out of slavery came to Cincinnati and stayed here. About 60% of all the people who came had purchased their freedom. They weren't runaways, they weren't part of the Underground Railroad, they weren't born free. About 60% had been born in slavery, had worked side jobs, and purchased their freedom.
According to Hurley, many of the African Americans who came north stayed in Cincinnati to remain close to family members who were still enslaved in the South. Eventually, some freemen even managed to save enough money to buy their loved ones out of slavery. But jobs at this time were limited for African Americans. Men could work as laborers, and the most lucrative opportunity was working as roustabouts on the steamboats. For women, virtually the only way they could earn any money was by doing domestic work.
Given the fact that African Americans were, generally speaking, at the lowest rung of the socioeconomic ladder, I think we can safely say that many of them died without having the ability to pay for their own burial and not being affiliated with a church that had its own burying ground. As a result, many of them would have ended up in the public burying ground and being buried at public expense.
One of the most powerful stories told by the bones of the Music Hall collection is the story of work. The kind of hard physical labor needed to build a rapidly growing city.
Here we can see typical normal development in one of the bones of the spine. But on this side, we can see a lot of bony growths that would be very painful for that person. It would indicate that that person had wear and tear arthritis, probably associated with a hard-working lifestyle.
In general, the skeletons of the Music Hall collection suggest a population that was physically strong and healthy. Little evidence of common diseases or disorders of the day, like arthritis, rickets, or syphilis, were seen in the bones. These findings were not surprising to Dr. Murray. Infectious illnesses of the time, such as cholera and tuberculosis, would usually be quickly fatal and would not leave their mark on bones. She did, however, see examples of clear traumatic injuries, old, healed fractures.
For example, these two bones that would be between your knee and your ankle are normally separated. But here we can see a fracture of some sort or an infection has bridged these two bones and held them together even in death. I like to romanticize about the people that lived at that time. Perhaps this man had his ankle run over by a wagon wheel or was stepped on by a horse.
Whoa. Oh!
Any number of things that might have happened to cause this poorly healed fracture.
You be all right?
As an anthropologist who has studied bones for years, Dr. Murray knew the remains could reveal more information than her eyes could see, especially about nutrition and growth patterns. As part of her analysis, she x-rayed a sample of the long bones at the Hamilton County Coroner's Office. Bernie Kersker is a retired homicide detective who was the director of the morgue at the time the bones were discovered. Recently, Murray met with him and talked about the steps they took in the x-ray analysis. Although generally healthy, a few of the bones x-rayed showed patterns suggesting that some of these adults, during their childhood, had stopped growing for a while, possibly due to illness or poor nutrition.
These lines that you see on here, they're called lines of growth arrest, Harris lines of growth arrest, and they represent where, when this person was a child, they may have stopped growing and started growing again, like the rings in a tree.
But the lines are also further proof of the hardiness of these people, because they show an individual survived that stress to their skeleton and then continued their normal growth. In addition to the x-ray analysis of the bones, Murray orders a few chemical tests to see what they could tell her about these people's diets.
I took one element, just the left upper arm bone, from 10 individuals, and I removed some cores of bone and sent them away to a laboratory for chemical analysis.
When the results from the lab came back, she was surprised to find that one of the most important contributors to the growth of Cincinnati was not a worker, a pioneer, or a financier. Instead, it was most likely a pig. Dr. Murray's study of the music hall bones had revealed a glimpse into the lives of some of the earliest inhabitants of the city of Cincinnati. The skeletons represented poor, hardworking people, many of whom were males and African Americans. Skeletal analysis helped reconstruct physical aspects of their health and biology, but chemical testing from a sample of the bones shed light on the kinds of foods these people may have eaten.
We get this tendency to think of poor people as having bad nutrition, poor nutrition, being malnourished, but the music hall sample had a high percentage of protein in the diet.
Murray had the chemical proof that these people most likely ate a high percentage of protein. But if these remains were those of common working people, how could they afford to put high-protein food sources on their tables? She asked historian Dan Hurley.
Cincinnati sits not only at the midpoint of the Ohio River, but between the two Miami rivers. And this is a great agricultural valley. It's a valley that was producing huge amounts of grain, particularly corn. The way to get corn to the market was to feed it to pigs, and then they became walking sacks of grain who could be driven to market.
Between the first frost of the year and early spring, farmers drove hundreds of thousands of pigs through the streets of Cincinnati. By the mid-1800s, not only had Cincinnati become the largest pork packing center in the United States, but the largest pork packing center in the world.
One of the problems with trying to recreate older cities is we never quite capture the smell. The smell was distinct and pungent and difficult. So not only did pigs leave droppings, but they also would die and croak on the way, or they would run off. Now, people could capture a stray pig and slaughter it for their own purposes. They could pick up a recently dead pig, cut it up and use it. But even so, they could also buy pork very cheaply from the slaughterhouses. There were always pigs in the streets of Cincinnati and in any city, really.
Thus, one explanation for how Cincinnati earned the colorful nickname Porkopolis.
We were known for the meatpacking industry well back into the early 1900s. And stories recount pigs being driven up from the canal boats and so forth up through the town to the slaughterhouses. And if you could run fast enough to catch a feral pig, a wild pig, you had pork for dinner that night. And so these people weren't starving in the sense of, other impoverished people. They may just have had to work a little harder or run a little faster for their dinner.
It looks great.
Meat was plentiful and available to even the poorest households, just as the chemical analysis suggested. But the Cincinnati diet included a much greater variety of foods than simply pork.
You got to remember also, Cincinnati, being in this agricultural region, was a place where a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables were brought in. This was a seasonal sort of thing, but people understood that. They canned. They were able to go into the markets, to the city's 6 public markets, buy these goods directly from farmers and pack them up. So besides the meat, which was what carried the protein, you had lots of vegetables, lots of fruits. So relatively speaking, for a large city, this was a healthy place to live. This was a good diet.
The chemical analysis also showed that the bones contained a number of metals, including lead, since only the rich of that day could afford to set their tables with lead-glazed pottery or pewter mugs. Only they, according to Dr. Murray, could be susceptible to accumulating high levels of lead in their skeletons. The people buried in the potter's field could not have afforded to eat off such finery, and thus would not have had the same opportunity to accumulate lead in their bones.
The chemical analysis in this case helped substantiate that these people really were from the lower strata of society. They were commoners.
Other metals studied through bone chemistry hinted at a unique and possibly tragic story in one man's life. One of the males sampled was found with at least one type of metal in his bones that probably reached toxic levels.
When the chemical analysis came back, one particular individual had unusually high copper, zinc, and cadmium levels. Zinc and copper are typically found in low levels in the skeleton, very trace levels, but this person had levels that were significantly higher than anyone else in this music hall sample. The interesting feature there was the cadmium. Cadmium is quite toxic at high levels, and for a person to have these metals in their skeleton suggests an occupational exposure, that this person was somehow exposed to those three metals in a way that no one else in this sample was.
Dan Hurley was able to take Murray's scientific findings and put them into historical perspective.
Since this was the supply center and the manufacturing center to supply people moving farther west, you had a whole range of manufacturing here. You had clothes being manufactured here. You had metal goods being manufactured here. Cincinnati becomes, what, the second or third largest steamboat manufacturing center in the United States. Well, as part of that, there's a lot of metal tools going into that. The chemistry of that is still a 19th century chemistry, and you end up in that iron with cadmium, you end up with other trace minerals that no one even would have given a thought to this being a problem, even if they could have identified it.
If, as the expression goes, work can sometimes kill you, the high level of cadmium in one man's skeleton may have contributed to his death.
If it's an occupational exposure, then you would assume that this man had a job and had this job for a long time in order to accumulate those metals in his skeleton. But cadmium, in the advanced stages of the disease, my research showed that it would be of the levels to make somebody possibly experience some psychological or dementia or health-related changes. And it may have been this man went from being a productive citizen at one time to being buried in a potter's field because of steadily declining mental health. So here we have a glimpse of what may have been this person's social fate despite a once healthy career.
The discovery of a mysterious collection of human bones during the renovation of an elevator shaft at the Cincinnati Music Hall in 1988 turned out to be a rare find. The study of this collection of bones provided significant clues to the human biology and lives of early European and West African inhabitants of Cincinnati, who, in turn, represented the thousands like them who moved west and helped settle this country.
I think their health and their stature shows that these were very hardy people. These were survivors. They may have wound up in a potter's field, but we're all going to wind up buried somewhere someday. The average lifespan of these people may have only been 40 to 45 years of age, but I think they lived a thorough, hardy life.
Unfortunately, there's no written record to tell the story of these forgotten people.
Historians in the past have tended to focus so much of their attention on the famous people that they haven't paid a lot of attention to ordinary people. But there's a real tendency in the field of history, especially in social history, today and for the last 25 years, to really focus on what I would refer to as ordinary people in everyday times.
The story of the Music Hall bones began with their mysterious discovery in 1988. By applying today's knowledge of forensic anthropology, Dr. Elizabeth Murray's study of these remains led to an amazing investigative journey where history and science intersected to tell the stories of some long-forgotten people whose labors helped build the city of Cincinnati. It's a deadly mystery, shrouded in myth and buried for more than a century in the Colorado mountains. The legend of a murderer and a cannibal who terrorized the West.
He is a man of historical controversy, considerable historical controversy.
100 years later, a team of modern-day scientists searches for the truth behind the story of Alfred Packer.
Boy, am I glad to see you.
And the basis for the historical controversy is whether or not Alfred Packer did the unthinkable.
But the stories written in the bones ignited debate.
There's no doubt that he was a cannibal. What is in doubt is that he's this ruthless murderer.
Only the bones hold the truth. Forensic scientists must unlock the long-buried secrets of the dead to solve the mystery of the Colorado Cannibal. The beauty of Colorado's majestic San Juan Mountains conceals deadly secrets. A grisly legend swirls around these mountains, a legend of a starving man who killed and ate his traveling companions.
There are some men who have the quality to make a myth. There are some myths that have the quality to make a man. It's the latter that's Alfred Packer.
Forensic scientist James Starrs doesn't like legends. He likes facts. And he doesn't just see dead people. He understands what they're saying. He's dug up the facts on some of history's most famous cases. The Lindbergh baby, Jesse James, Lizzie Borden's mutilated family. Now, Starrs will use 21st century science to unearth the truth about the bizarre 19th century murder case of Alfred Packer, the Colorado Cannibal.
Everything about the case attracted me. Start with cannibalism, start with multiple murders, start with the San Juan Mountains, start with prospectors, start with looking for gold.
The myth of the Colorado Cannibal actually starts here, Salt Lake City, Utah, November 1873. Winter is blowing in, but so are rumors of gold. Untold riches almost 500 miles away in Breckenridge, Colorado. 21 men prepare to join the gold rush in the San Juan Mountains. They'll find the gold and silver buried there, or they'll die trying. They just need someone to lead their party. Alfred Packer tells them he knows the way. But Packer doesn't know these mountains. He's not even a prospector. He's a shoemaker who's sick of making shoes. To make it through the mountains in winter, the prospectors need an experienced guide and lots of luck. They don't have either. 21 men head out from Salt Lake City with their dreams of striking it rich. They have enough supplies to make the long journey. They buy provisions, including feed for the horses. They have planned for everything, or so they think.
Storm's coming.
After only a few weeks on the trail, winter roars into the Colorado Rockies.
They didn't know what to expect, and they certainly didn't know what to expect here in January. In February, when you get the snowstorms and the ice and the difficulty in traveling, and the fact that it's slower to get from one point to another, and you go through your food supplies relatively fast.
The men slow down in the snow and ice. The cold is unbearable. They can only cover 3 miles a day. At this rate, it will take them 5 months to reach Breckenridge, more than twice what they planned. They lose part of their food crossing the Green River. Then, after 10 weeks on the trail, they stumble across a Ute Indian camp. The chief knows the Colorado winters and offers a stern warning.
It was the Ute Indian chief, Ouray, who told all of them, don't go into the San Juan Mountains.
The prospectors decide to stay with the Utes till late winter. But a few are more afraid of losing the gold than of losing their lives. 6 men ignore Chief Ouray's advice.
They're afraid other prospectors are going to hit the rich gold and silver strikes before they will. So they're anxious to be the first ones on the ground. It's a little bit of greed that we're seeing here.
The youngest of the 6 men is an 18-year-old named George Noon. He's from San Francisco, so they call him California. The old man is Israel Swan. There's James Humphrey from Philadelphia. Frank Miller, who used to be a butcher. And Shannon Bell is a Civil War vet with a shock of red hair. As they're leaving the Indian camp, Alfred Packer offers to lead the party.
He was a leader that no one should have followed because he was taking these people into the San Juan Mountains in February of 1874, which we know from the records today was the worst winter that they've ever had in the San Juan Mountains in terms of cold and snow. And without any horses, with 1 week's provisions, he led a group of 5 of them, himself included, making 6, into the mountains when the others of the 21 total that left Provo said, no way, you're on your own. We're not going to go with you.
Packer's goal, the Los Pinos Indian Agency, 75 miles away. They have 10 days to get there. If they don't, they'll run out of food. 10 days later, there is no sign of them at Los Pinos. Weeks pass, and still no sign. For 2 long months, there is no trace of the men. Nothing. Not a word. Finally, in early spring, a lone figure wanders into the Los Pinos Indian Agency.
Name's Alfred Packer. How you doing?
The camp commander, General Charles Adams, wants to know where the rest of Packer's party is and what took him so long to reach them. Packer tells his story. We were caught in a blizzard, Packer says. When the weather cleared, the others headed out, but Packer says he couldn't keep up.
The rest of the fellows wanted to go on, but my feet were bleeding and I could barely see.
They left him with nothing more than a rifle, a few dollars, and a promise to send help.
Don't forget me now.
How was it that the 16 men that were at the Indian camp came back, but the 5 men that were with you never came out? What happened?
Adams doesn't buy Packer's story.
I don't know.
So there's immediate suspicion that they may not show up, that they in fact may not even be alive at this point.
The general presses him for more details. Packer starts to squirm.
Then he begins to change his story. Packer begins to say, well, maybe they weren't all alive.
But tell me what happened.
He tells his tale again. It started snowing. He said it wouldn't stop. We were starving. It wasn't a week before old Israel Swan died. Packer tells the general there was only one way to survive. They did the unthinkable. The living ate the dead.
Alfred Packer didn't want to die, but then, of course, if there's this bonanza of flesh and you're about to die from starvation and the people are all dead, you help yourself to the leavings and you commit cannibalism.
Packer goes on to tell the commander They took some bits of meat from Swan's chest and legs. They had to do it to survive. Packer continues.
So we kept going.
The men kept on hiking, and about 4 or 5 days later, James Humphrey died.
Did the pocketbook and the money belong to Humphreys too?
Yes, I looked in the pocketbook and I saw he had the money and I took it. About 10 days out from camp, 4 or 5 days afterwards, Humphrey died and was also eaten. He had about $133.
Now there were only 3 of them. And one night, when Packer returns to the camp after gathering firewood, he finds Miller dead.
Sometime afterwards, while I was carrying wood, the butcher was killed, and the other 2 told me accidentally, and he was eaten.
Packer says Bell thought Miller, who had rheumatism, was slowing the party down. Miller should be the next to be sacrificed. That's why Bell killed him.
Several days later, Bell killed the Californian Noon.
Once again, he felt he and Bell had no choice but to eat the young man. Packer says the 2 marched on, and then Bell tried to make dinner out of him too. But Packer shot first.
Shot him, covered up the remains, and I cut a piece off of him.
Yes, he tells General Adams he did kill Shannon Bell. And then he ate his remains. He had to. If he hadn't, he would have died. Adams still isn't convinced. If there are 5 bodies out there in the mountains, he wants to see them. Adams orders a search party and tells Packer to lead them to the corpses. But they find nothing. Wild animals could have carried off the bodies, or Packer could be leading the searchers on a wild goose chase. Without corpses, Packer can't be charged. Adams has no choice but to release him. Later that summer, an artist sketching for Harper's Magazine stumbles upon a truly hellish sight.
He peers into a grove of willows that are growing along the river, shadowy in there, but he can dimly make out the rotting carcasses of these 5 men that are lying on the ground. No attempt was made to bury them.
John Randolph has found 5 decomposing bodies. Immediately, he grabs his pencils and pad and starts drawing. At the time, the bodies were partially decomposed and showed injuries to their heads. It captivates Harper's readers and grabs the attention of one man in particular. They seem to be Packer's victims.
I could barely see.
General Adams needs proof. So he rounds up one of the original 21 prospectors. Maybe he can identify what's left of the bodies. The prospector says these are the men who left the Ute camp and never came back. The same men who were with Alfred Packer. Alfred Packer is arrested and charged with murder. He's not charged with cannibalism for one simple reason. It's not against the law. Packer is held in a makeshift jail on a local ranch. This little shack can't hold Alfred Packer. He's not about to wait around to face this frontier town's judge and jury. He waits for the right moment, picks the lock, and vanishes into the mountains. The commander rounds up search parties to find him and bring the suspected murderer back. Neighboring communities form up posses to track him down. When word of his escape reaches the surviving prospectors, they swear vengeance against him. They hunt for months, but can't catch him. Packer simply disappears. Was Alfred Packer a murderer, or did he do what anyone would have done? James Starrs is determined to find the answers.
There's much more to the tale of Alfred Packer, it seemed to me. I finally decided to put to rest some of these questions that I had in my mind by going out to Lake City, Colorado, and seeing if I couldn't find out more than the textbooks said about Alfred Packer.
It won't be easy. The San Juan Mountains have held a tight grip on Alfred Packer's secret for nearly 130 years. Stars has a lot of catching up to do, but using modern forensics, he hopes to find the bones of the 5 prospectors and listen to what they have to say. It's Star's only chance to solve the legend of the Colorado Cannibal once and for all. Forensic scientist James Starrs wants to find out what really happened on that cold, deadly day in the Rocky Mountains. His team will dig up long-buried bodies and listen to what they have to say. But first, he has to find them. No one really knows where they're buried. Legend leads him to a place called Dead Man's Gulch. Starrs has assembled a forensic team that includes a pathologist, an anthropologist, a geophysicist, and an archaeologist, even a forensic backhoe operator. Starrs is so driven to bring logic to this legend that he is paying for all this himself. But he only has enough money for 30 days, and the clock is ticking.
The most immediate concern was to make certain that I was right as to the location of the burial place. And then we did the ground penetrating radar. That sold me. Whatever's under the ground there there are anomalies, 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe even more than 5. But there are anomalies there that are very close to the surface.
All right.
After we only took a few inches off the top of the soil, once again, jumping Jehoshaphat's, we find lines of stones all lined up, pretty much in an east-west orientation, which of course is the Christian burial orientation.
The stones could be marking a gravesite. The team digs deeper, then strikes pay dirt, a bone.
There was no doubt that the first bone was human, no doubt at all. It clearly was a skull bone, as you say, a temporal bone from the skull.
Any marks?
As the crew uncovers more dirt, the full skeletons begin to emerge. Finding the bodies after all these years is rare. Animals could have carried the bones away. They could have been washed away by floods or pulverized into dust, but they weren't.
The most remarkable feature of the entire situation was how lucky I was. How lucky that they were in such fine condition, such well-preserved condition, and how lucky I was they were all buried separately, one from the other.
Starrs' team discovers 5 skeletons. But are they the 5 men who went looking for gold with Alfred Packer?
Well, so we have a record of it.
Before they remove any of the bones for study, they must completely document the scene. The team photographs the skeletons. They have been posing for this picture for nearly 130 years.
We went up in the backhoe, took a picture of all 5 before they were boxed and removed, as they were laid out.
These photographs could hold the key to identifying the skeletons. Even now, their positions could tell investigators who they were, and more importantly, how they died.
You always have to make certain, even when you've got some identifying features, that you've got the right person or the right persons. And I anticipated that the naysayers would say, well, I know, but a lot of people were killed out there.
Once the bones are photographed, forensic anthropologist Walter Birkby supervises their removal. But identifying these bodies won't be easy. If this is the Packer party, these bones have been buried in Colorado's frozen soil since before it was a state, before dental records, before DNA. And to make things worse, one of the skulls is missing. To identify the skeletons, the team simply gives each one a letter. From left to right, they are recorded as A, B, C, D, and E. It's not the most personal way to refer to them, but for now, it's the best the team can do.
I'm a great believer in looking at the victims of crimes and having our primary interest on them. Everybody knows Alfred Packer's name all over Colorado. How many people can tell me the names of any of the 5 victims?
California Noon, Israel Swan, James Humphrey, Frank Miller, and Shannon Bell. All that Stars and his team have to solve the mystery and identify these men are 5 skeletons and a couple of rolls of film. Forensic anthropologist Bruce Anderson notices one more piece of evidence. He takes a closer look at Randolph's drawing of the bodies that appeared in Harper's Weekly.
As we're taking photographs of these 5 individuals, they look very familiar, and we weren't sure why right off the bat. But then it dawned on us that they bear a striking resemblance to the bodies as depicted by John Randolph.
Randolph drew these macabre sketches to horrify and fascinate his 19th century readers. Now, they're being used by 21st century scientists to solve the legend of the Colorado cannibal.
They were all in the same position as Randolph had them, and some of them, in fact, in the same articulation of arms and legs and heads and so on, the way that Randolph had drawn them, which indicated to us not only that they were human, but that they were not 5 random prospectors who had been killed by the Indians. They were 5 prospectors who were related directly and were the 5 prospectors that had been accompanying Alfred Packer.
The left lower limb.
Anderson compares the skeletons in the ancient sketches to those in the modern photos. He starts with Israel Swan.
And if you take a look at the person in the Randolph sketch that's labeled Israel Swan, we see that the left thigh bone is disconnected from the left hip bone. The only individual that matches in the grave photograph is individual E, where in fact the left thigh bone is clearly disconnected from the left hip bone.
Anderson then moves on to skeleton C.
Taking a look at individual C in the excavation photo, we see that the right leg is extended, the left leg is flexed at the knee and the hip, the head is tilted to the left. The only individual that matches individual C here in the excavation photo corresponds to the person depicted in the middle of the Randolph sketch and labeled as Shannon Wilson Bell. We see the hip.
They're all there. Miller, Humphrey, Bell, young California Noon, old Israel Swan. But how did they die? The cold bones tell a chilling tale. A tale that doesn't match Packer's. Back in the lab, Walter Birkby deciphers the clues written in the bones.
They were maybe sleeping. It was colder than a well digger's fanny in the Klondike, and so therefore they were all bundled up. Every one of them had hatchet marks to the skull, multiple hatchet marks. They're deep, they're fracturing, they serve the purpose of dispatching the individual.
Birkby counts 478 tool marks on the 5 skeletons. The evidence also indicates an axe smashed in the skulls. Natural causes? No way. These men were murdered, and not the way Packer explained it.
They either hit themselves in the head and committed suicide, or somebody did it to them. Now, what would you suspect would be the likely story on a situation like that? These guys are not going to sit there and club themselves to death just so that they can put themselves out of their misery. That doesn't make any kind of sense at all. They were striving to remain alive long enough so that the snow would eventually melt and they can get the hell out of those damn mountains.
We ought to be able to shoot something up here.
Did Alfred Packer take a hatchet to all 5 men? The injuries to the bones tell Birkby someone hacked all 5 men to death.
One person did it because the modus operandi is the same. It doesn't vary that much between individuals. The only guy to come walking out of that camp was Alfred Packer, and he was in pretty good shape.
James Starrs and his team are digging for answers, and they've already unearthed a few. It now looks like Alfred Packer is a liar. But these skeletons have many more stories to tell, and some will cut right to the bone. Forensic scientist James Starrs and his team have found the bodies of the men who went into the San Juan Mountains with Alfred Packer. Now these forensic specialists study the bones to uncover the truth about the Colorado Cannibal. Toolmark expert Luke Haig finds some gruesome evidence buried with the men. He notices small nicks on the men's forearms. By comparing the marks to various tools and weapons used at the time, he determines they were made by a heavy-bladed object, like a hatchet. It is evidence that the men tried to fight off their axe-wielding attacker with their bare arms.
If you're trying to protect yourself, you stand to get clipped or caught by the weapon, the hatchet or axe, as its landing blows on a conscious, responding individual.
The marks clearly show which of the men fought hardest against his attacker. 18-year-old California Noon.
A true, vigorous 17, 18-year-old. He had numerous hatchet marks. He had been multiple times in defense of himself. This wasn't one strike. He was hit once, twice, 3 times. It was a horrendous sight to see from the bones how many individual cuts he had in his arm while he was protecting himself.
One of the men who fought back was Shannon Bell, whom Packer says he killed in self-defense.
No question at all, these were defensive wounds. What it says is that the man that Alfred Packer said that he shot in defense of himself was in fact defending himself against a hatchet-wielding murderer. Uh-oh. Alfred Packer, you've just been shot down.
The bones show that Alfred Packer lied about killing the men in self-defense. But they also show he wasn't lying about the thing that made him a legend. Only one thing could make these tiny tool marks.
And to get this kind of a mark, you're taking a knife and following around on the curvature of the bone in an area, for example, where meat and tendons attach to the bone itself to be able to remove and peel away the meat.
After he killed his companions, the Colorado Cannibal literally filleted them. Alfred Packer butchered his dead friends, the same way he would have butchered a deer or an elk. The proof is in the bones.
This is where you never know. This is the terra incognita, the unknown ingredient. You never know. I never thought that we would find cut marks that we could actually see after 115 years in the ground.
At last, Starrs believes he has answered all the questions. He even understands why Packer did it. The Packer party headed into the San Juan Mountains, and winter roared in after them. they were snowbound and starving. Packer had to do something to survive.
He is a man of considerable historical controversy. And the basis for the historical controversy is whether or not Alfred Packer did the unthinkable. You think unthinkable is killing. No, unthinkable is cannibalizing. Cannibalizing people after he had killed them. He killed them so that he could cannibalize them. He wanted to survive. And the others were not going to if he had his way. And he had his way.
The legend of Alfred Packer was born. And after the news broke that the Colorado cannibal escaped from a makeshift jail, his legend continued to grow. All over the West, people were terrified Packer was coming after them.
His name was never entirely forgotten. If you read papers of the time, whenever there was a horrible murder or anything that occurred, the suspicion always rested on Packer. So he became a boogeyman of sorts, that anything that went wrong, they could assign it to be Packer.
For 10 years, the man-eater roamed the mountains, never staying in one place very long.
Packer made a very good attempt to be as minimally visible as possible, and that included changing his name and going under an alias, as well as living in areas that weren't well populated.
He is the Elvis Presley of the Old West. There are sightings everywhere, but Packer is the king of laying low. Then, one night, in a Wyoming roadhouse, his luck finally runs out. He sits down at the end of the bar. At the other end is a man named Frenchy Cabazon, one of the 21 men in the original prospecting party. Even after 10 years, Cabazon can't forget that face.
I'm sure that's him. It's gotta be him.
The man in charge of the investigation is General Charles Adams, the same man who saw through Packer's lies so many years before. Adams sits down to talk with Packer again. Now, Packer hands him another version of what happened. Packer says his party was surprised by a blizzard. It started snowing and didn't stop. They were starving. They ate rosebuds, pine gum. It got so bad that even a few ate their shoes. Packer tells the general he went to get firewood, and when he came back, Shannon Bell was roasting a piece of meat and holding a hatchet.
And he sees me and he makes for me, so I shot him.
Packer says he shot Bell twice. The first bullet grazed him, and the second bullet hit him in the stomach. Then he finished him off.
Then I could see that the other fellows was killed. They was all dead. That's what really happened.
Well, Mr. Packer, this story is different than what you told me 9 years ago.
But Adams isn't buying. He's been burned by Packer's stories before. Adams charges Alfred Packer with the murder of old Israel Swan. The prosecutor wants to hold off trying Packer for any of the other murders in case he loses this case. Then he could put Packer on trial for the other murders. In the 1870s, it wasn't a problem to try a man twice for the same crime. There are no witnesses, and really no evidence. All the prosecution has are 5 dead bodies and Packer's changing story. But Packer can't mount much of a defense. It's his word against that of a dead man.
Mr. Packer, will you please rise?
The verdict is never in doubt.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Alfred Packer, guilty.
At some point within the corporate limits of
Judge
town,
Melville B. Gary passes sentence.
County of Hinsdale, and between the hours of 8 a.m. and 3 p.m. of said day, you then and there, by said sheriff, be hung by the neck until you are dead, dead, dead. May God have mercy on your soul. Bailiff, remove the defendant. Jury, your work is appreciated. Thank you. You are dismissed. Court is dismissed.
But Packer had broken out of jail before. He might do it again. So an angry mob of townspeople forms outside the Gunnison courthouse. They don't want to wait for procedures or appeals. So Packer is moved for his own safety. Then his hanging gets hung up by a technicality. Packer's attorney appeals his case, and this time he wins.
What was unexpected, however, was a legal twist that the conviction was overturned based on the fact those murders had taken place on an Indian reservation that was located within the territory of Colorado. Packer was actually convicted using state statutes from the state of Colorado. Enough time had transpired that it had gone from a territory to a state at this point. So the conviction was overturned based on the fact it was an Indian reservation in a territory.
The Colorado cannibal gets a new trial, and this time, prosecutors hold nothing back. Packer is indicted for the killing of all 5 men. The jury finds Packer guilty of manslaughter.
Yes, Your Honor, we have.
He is sentenced to 40 years.
Guilty on all 5 counts of voluntary manslaughter.
Thank you.
Just 8 years for every man he murdered and then devoured. 12 years after his crime, Alfred Packer is finally sent to prison.
To 8 years in the state of Colorado.
Now, the legend takes an even stranger twist.
For a total of 40 years.
The same mob that saw Packer lurking behind every tree and then wanted to hang him from one begins to feel sorry for him.
There was a subtle shift in the public's perception of Packer between the 1870s, when he was celebrated as a Colorado man-eater, one of the few cases of that had ever occurred. By the start of the 20th century, however, there was a great deal of sentiment in favor of Packer, that he had perhaps been railroaded, that there were other circumstances that were unknown that had put him in that jail cell for all those years.
As Packer sits in prison, public opinion starts to shift. People begin to believe that he is innocent. And now, 100 years later, one forensic scientist thinks the same thing. James Starrs might have gotten it wrong. And Alfred Packer was railroaded not once, but twice. The case of the Colorado cannibal is settled. At least in James Starrs' mind, an open and shut case. But when you're dealing with a legend, things are never that easy. Some people don't see the Packer story as a mystery at all. They're convinced Packer acted in self-defense.
Public sentiment had changed from the frontier days, when the tragedy occurred, to the beginning of the 20th century, and there was a great deal of sympathy for Packer by this time, and it was fanned by Polly Pry of the Denver Post, who was using this as a publicity ploy to assist the Denver Post perhaps in selling more newspapers. It was a good story.
Newspaperwoman Polly Pry was a contemporary of Packer's. She interviewed him several times and became a champion of his cause. 21st century science may back her up. This pistol has fired the imaginations of contemporary skeptics. It was reportedly found 55 years ago, not far from Dead Man's Gulch, the place where the 5 men were buried. It's been waiting for the chance to tell its story ever since. Scientist Rick Duget believes this rusty old Colt may be the most important piece of evidence ever found in the case of the Colorado cannibal.
This particular gun, greatly deteriorated, was tagged as part of the Packer incident. It was discovered in the collection and was said to have been discovered at the site of the Packer murders.
It could be the very gun that Alfred Packer used to kill Shannon Bell. If it is, Packer was telling the truth the whole time. It's certainly old enough It was made over 10 years before the murders. Even the Denver Post quoted Packer as saying he shot Bell with a revolver. And there's more. Packer says he shot Bell twice. The gun is missing 2 bullets. And then there's this, a button. Duget thinks it came from the shirt Bell wore the day he died because of the tiny pieces of lead he found on it.
These lead fragments are highly consistent with the lead that was sampled from the bullet in Alfred Packer's gun, and they're highly consistent with lead that was sampled from similar cartridges made around the same time by Remington Arms. So given these 3 consistencies, it leads us to believe that this most likely is a bullet fragment that came from Alfred Packer's gun.
Duget doesn't have the bullet that killed Bell, but he thinks he knows where it landed. Right here, in the hip bone of skeleton A, the man Duget believes is Shannon Bell.
Well, this is really the skeleton that we're mainly worried about. This is Shannon Bell. This is the left ilium showing the bullet hole inside the ilium. This is a blow-up of the entrance wound here. And this is a blow-up of the exit wound on the ilium of Shannon Bell.
So now Packer's defenders have their evidence. Packer shot Bell with this pistol, just like he told General Adams. The bullet left its mark on this button and went through Bell's pelvis. It's enough to convince Duget that Alfred Packer was innocent.
The legend states that Alfred Packer is a murdering cannibal. What we have done is given some credence to part of Alfred Packer's story. And if you can say that part of his story has credence, then maybe the rest of Packer's story is also believable.
But there is one more piece to the puzzle. One last calcified clue that will solve the case of the Colorado cannibal once and for all. It's something Shannon Bell has had up his sleeve for nearly 130 years. For more than a century, most everyone around here assumed Alfred Packer was a murderer and a cannibal. But new evidence shows he may have been wrongly convicted. Dr. Rick Duget believes Packer acted in self-defense. This gun, this button, and this bullet hole tell him that's how it happened. But James Starrs and his forensic team, the ones who dug up the bones in the first place, say that theory is full of holes, starting with the notion that this hole was made by a bullet.
I looked at it, and I looked at it under the microscope, and we x-rayed it and everything else, and it didn't look like any gunshot wound that we'd ever seen. So it's carnivore mark, and we see that same kind of mark on other bones that are in the burial pit. It's very typical of things that we see all the time in the remains.
No, we'd expect...
Duget disagrees.
Gross disarticulation of the bodies, meaning the bones being...
He's a zoologist, and he knows a bite mark from a bullet hole.
No, this is not carnivore activity. If this was made from a large carnivore, what we'd expect to see is bone fragmentation in 2 opposite directions, where the canines actually mesh together, pushing bone fragments away from each other. So we'd see smooth areas on one side, fragmentation on another, and we don't see that.
Starrs agrees that several things could have made this hole, but there's no way one of them was a bullet.
It's very discernible when a bullet has left a hole in a bone. A hard surface such as a bone will show, particularly in the exit area, the cavitation that occurs, the larger outward cavitation that occurs when a bullet exits through the bone.
Because Starrs and his team believe this is not a bullet hole, they are convinced Duget is looking at the wrong skeleton. Duget's theory is based on his identification of Shannon Bell as Skeleton A. Stars and his team believe Skeleton C is Shannon Bell. The idea that Bell is Skeleton A started with a newspaper reporter who didn't check his facts. There's only one way to settle the debate. Star's team has to prove that Skeleton C is Shannon Bell. To do that, they'll go back to the only records about him that exist. Bell fought in the Civil War, so the team examines his military records. Bell was wounded in battle. A Confederate bullet went through his left arm and shattered his elbow.
When we examined the remains, he did have an old gunshot injury to his left elbow.
Once again, the bones hold the answers. Shannon Bell is Skeleton C. The all-star team has used 21st century science to confirm the verdicts of two pioneer juries.
You know, we had a chance to use techniques of forensic anthropology that are usually applied to modern medical legal cases on this historic case. It was a really good chance to try to answer some questions on a case that was well over 100 years old.
At last, nearly 130 years after they were bludgeoned to death in the Colorado wilderness, Alfred Packer's victims can rest in peace.
I put a face on them. I put a life on them. These are people. I looked at Israel Swan and I saw the damage to his spine from all the digging that he had done over these many years as a miner. I felt for that man. How could he possibly be out there doing what he was doing, expecting to survive?
You all right? No, I'm not all right.
George Noon, what was he doing out there? And who was he? All these things to me make these people live. And the more they live, the more you suffer for their death.
The bones have spoken. 5 men died in the frigid San Juan Mountains in the winter of 1874. California Noon, Israel Swan, James Humphrey, Frank Miller, and Shannon Bell. Alfred Packer killed them all.
He is the most malodorous man that I've ever seen. In all the books I've written about crimes being committed, he is the most foul of the foul, in my view. Why? Because not only did he cannibalize them, but he killed 5 so he could survive when he could have killed 1 and survived off 1 and killed the other, seriatim, individually. So he killed all 5. The whole concept of what he had done more than boggles the mind. It's destructive of the mind.
But Dr. Rick Duget will always have his doubts.
Common belief has us believing that Alfred Packer is this crazed murdering cannibal, which there's no doubt that he was a cannibal and that he cannibalized all the members of the party. However, what is in doubt is that he's this ruthless murderer. He's always maintained that he killed Shannon Bell in self-defense after Shannon Bell had killed the others and turned on him.
Grant Houston is like a lot of people around here. He doesn't really know what happened, and he really doesn't want to.
The enduring fascination with the Packer legend is that we'd never really know the story, and I would hope that remains, that we'll never really know whether he was guilty or innocent. I think that's why it's continued on for well over a century.
Alfred Packer was one of the most notorious criminals of the Old West. But some will always believe he was convicted of a crime he didn't commit. Either way, he died a free man. After serving less than half his 40-year sentence, Packer's health began to fail. The governor released him on parole. He spent the rest of his life south of Denver, no more than 200 miles from where his 5 victims died. On April 24th, 1907, 33 years and 8 days after he wandered into Los Pinos Indian Agency, Alfred Packer finally died. His death certificate says he died of senility, trouble, and worry. But even in death, there is one more legend. After leaving prison, Alfred Packer never ate meat again. The Colorado cannibal became a vegetarian. The jungles of Guatemala hold a sickening secret. The bones of 200,000 victims of a Central American madman.
I remember finding 32 gunshot wounds in one guy.
No one escaped the brutality.
So that's a full set of baby teeth.
Yeah, maybe about 5 years old.
Now, a team of scientists struggle under the constant threat of death to identify thousands of human remains and find the evidence that will bring their killers to justice. Welcome to paradise, Guatemala. Bucolic mountains, bountiful markets, beautiful people, Mayans mostly. Nearly 500 years ago, Spanish conquistadors almost wiped out their ancestors. 25 years ago, dictator Jose Rios Montt tried to finish the job. His thugs murdered over 200,000 Guatemalans. Over half were Mayan. They targeted men mostly. But when the shooting started, the soldiers' guns didn't discriminate. They slaughtered men, women, and especially children in an attempt possibly to wipe out an entire generation. Now, their bodies lie silent. Freddie Petrarelli could have been one of them. One more little Guatemalan boy who went off to play and never came back. But his family escaped just in time. He grew up in New York. He became an anthropologist. And now he has come home.
When I was in college, I was looking for something that would connect me with Guatemala. So I went to the American Anthropological Association meeting. And what I saw was pictures of people like me. I was 24, 25 at the time, conducting these investigations, digging the bodies out of the ground, analyzing the remains.
Petrarelli traveled to Guatemala with the team from the Anthropological Association in 1995. He has been working in Guatemala ever since. His goal is to find evidence of Rios Montt's atrocities. Without it, the murderers can never be brought to trial.
Right now, all we have are stories. My brother was killed. My father went to work one day and never came back. What we are doing is proving that a crime was committed. We provide the evidence that make these deaths legally official.
It seems the bodies are buried everywhere. And until Petrarelli uncovers every last one of them, neither the dead nor the living can rest in peace. He knew this when he first learned about a grave in the village of Akul Nebaj.
The military, according to testimony, picked out 23 men. 5 of them tried to get away. And I remember finding 32 gunshot wounds in one guy. He was tied against a tree and they used him as target practice in front of 200 people in the community.
Then the murderers made their next victims dig a trench.
And then with their hands tied behind their backs, they made them line up, and one by one they shot them at the edge of the grave, and they fell in the grave.
Political upheaval is all too common in Guatemala. Guatemala City is the country's vibrant capital, the center of power and government. But from 1960 to 1996, the government was at war with its own citizens, a war that resulted in the deaths of 200,000 Guatemalans. A United Nations report blamed Guatemala's civil war on the government's long history of protecting the interests of the wealthy minority while disregarding impoverished native populations like the Mayan. As protesters for greater social equality grew more vocal, the government sent the army to silence them. Rebel guerrilla armies organized to fight back. Guatemala was immersed in a civil war. The bloodshed carried on for 36 years, during which time military coups were common, with 10 different political regimes rising to power. The early 1980s marked the most violent period, when the state-sponsored campaign of terror targeted Mayans accused of being rebel collaborators. Rios Mont's men worked with inhuman efficiency. They exterminated tens of thousands with a bullet to the head. They were the lucky ones.
The children, for example, they killed by taking them from their arms and legs and swinging them against trees, rocks, walls, anything of the sort. Testimony says, for example, the women, they usually would strip down and rape before, and then they would kill them by pieces sometimes.
What happened to the Mayans was a modern-day genocide. The United Nations brokered a peace accord in 1996 between the government-backed military and the rebel forces. A UN verification group assured the Guatemalan people that the peace agreements were met and that human rights abuses would end. The shooting has stopped. Pecciarelli's team at the Anthropology Foundation of Guatemala worked to bring these killers to justice. But it's dangerous work. Rios Montt and his monsters are still out there, watching.
A couple of years ago, things got a bit difficult because we started receiving death threats. The letters were very specific. They spoke about not allowing us to continue the work. And none of these cases, they said in this letter, none of these cases will ever go to trial, so you're doing it for nothing. And we've allowed you to excavate all these skeletons in peace, but your families are gonna bury your bodies and the bodies of your children in tears. But those death threats definitely mean that our work has had an impact on somebody. We see that somebody is nervous because of the work we're doing.
And in Guatemala, there are no idle threats. But the work must continue. Pecciarelli's teams identified over 400 grave sites. He needs help. Jose Soaz Navar has lived in Guatemala all his life. For him, every set of bones may be someone he knew. Forensic expert Elizabeth Murray came from Cincinnati. Dr. Clyde Snow, one of the most famous forensic anthropologists on the planet, has agreed to help. Snow has done this gruesome work all over the world. Argentina, Bosnia, Iraq. His expertise is invaluable on a job this massive and this monstrous. Snow always starts by talking with the locals.
Here in Guatemala, very often we are led to the gravesite because typically what would happen would be that the army would come in, conduct the massacre, and then 24, maybe 48 hours later, when the survivors were able to creep back, you might say, sometimes at night, they would come in and they would make the burials.
Pecciarelli and his team listen to each villager's story. They begin to earn the Mayans' trust. Now, almost every day, he hears one more story, and the villagers lead him to one more grave. At every dig, there is an audience, a gallery of Guatemalans, hoping that today is the day their long-vanished loved one reappears. Memories haunt the survivors. Memories of the horrible way their children were murdered, of husbands killed without warning. And one question haunts them. Why?
A lot of the people in the communities feel as if they deserved what happened because of something wrong they were doing. But they've come to realize that they didn't do anything wrong and that they don't have any reason to put their heads down.
Jose Suas Navar knows he's uncovering more than bones. He's uncovering pain.
It helps them to talk about what happened. Even though they lived through all this, there's been no opportunity until now for them to talk about it, to replay the death and the horror stories.
The survivors still suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. So the United Nations has added one more player to Pecciarelli's team. Christina Ehrlich is a UN representative assigned to work with caseworkers.
I think the processes here can be done very near to the people. It's a very human process. They accompany the people in a way that they start to lose their fear. They open up. They start to talk. They can feel that there are also other people that need to talk to get free again, to cure their trauma, to cure their internal wound that is opening again because of the exhumation process.
Pecciarelli's team must put a name on these victims. It is no easy task. In a town called Panimache, Rios Mont's men slaughtered 35 men, women, and children. Freddie Pecciarelli knows what to expect, but for what he is about to see, he can never truly be ready. 200,000 Guatemalans lie buried under Guatemala's lush greenery, massacred by dictator Jose Rios Montt and his men. Anthropologist Freddie Pecciarelli is on a mission to find the victims, return them to their families, and bring the guilty to justice.
The work is very, very complicated in Guatemala, and it's dangerous as well. So people have to be devoted, and they have to be willing to risk their own safety to do this kind of work, as well as they have to be willing to be subjected to the things they're gonna see.
He and his team head 3 hours north to the tiny village of Panimache. The children greet them first. These young Mayans have only heard about their lost generation. Today, they'll see it firsthand.
I guarantee you they will understand after we're done. They will. And they'll get to see everything. We usually allow the kids to come and watch and ask questions. It's not just a forensic investigation. It's a whole process that involves their lives today and what happened to their family members 20 years ago.
The villager's story is terrifyingly familiar. In 1982, Rios Montt's soldiers rounded up 35 men, women, and children. They shot most of them, one bullet to the back of the head. The rest, they hacked to death with machetes. When the murderers left, the surviving villagers quickly buried the victims in several unmarked graves. Now, Pecciarelli will finally let the dead tell their stories. All the work at the site is handled with great precision and care. The dirt is removed slowly and carefully. The team does not want to miss any small bones or artifacts that might be crucial in identifying a body. Every step is photographed so that the team can document every item they find. The digging has barely begun when the team uncovers a scrap of clothing. They know they are in the right place.
It could be a belt, it could be a skirt.
A trim of a skirt.
Then, the first skeleton.
Another skull?
Yeah. But what we'll do now is we'll take out the fill and then we'll go down around the edges. I'm gonna take a walk to the other side. You wanna see it? Because we're gonna be getting something there.
Snow remains behind to watch the work at this site, while Pecciarelli and Murray move on to the next one. The second grave site reveals the skeletal remains of 4 people, an entire family. A father, mother, child, and an infant, all slaughtered. They were buried with the mother holding the baby.
So clearly there's cases where when the family buries them, they have clear understanding of the relationships and
Yeah, and it's evident in the way they bury them.
For Pecciarelli, every bone, every artifact is important. He never knows what he might find that will help him ID the victims and possibly the killers. There are no shortcuts when the stakes are this high. The field team of 20 will number each item found in the grave. They categorize each and every bone. Workers draw sketches and take photographs to record the exact location of every artifact and bone. These murders were committed more than 20 years ago. But today, this is an active crime scene.
We will write everything we can in the field. We won't analyze the trauma, but if we see a clear gunshot wound, we'll write it down.
Pecciarelli saves the in-depth analysis for the lab. There, his team will closely examine everything. Bones, teeth, the tiniest bit of flesh.
Claro. They were covered, this grave, they were covered with these ponchos, these quilts.
family covered the one.
Mayans have no medical records or dental charts, but they have these. Hand-woven fabrics that are as individual as fingerprints. Guatemalan DNA.
Yeah, at least this is where we got the whole pelvis goes into.
Their clothes and blankets are as distinctive as their faces. So IDing the dead hangs literally by a thread.
The Mayan women, because they do so much weaving, They're extremely, I call it textile-minded. They know their textiles. They have great memories for the colors and patterns. So that when we're opening the grave, very often the wife or the mother may be there, and she'll remember, for example, what the person was wearing, sometimes in a great deal of detail, from 20 or 25 years before. She'll know right away that, that's her son or her husband or brother.
The clothes can also show how a murder was committed, and maybe who committed it.
In the field, we look at the clothing very rapidly just to make sure, especially in a child, that there are no epiphyses left. The ends of the bones might not be fused yet. And also, in case there's holes caused by a knife, a gun, but most of that would be done in the laboratory. Eventually, the clothing will be looked at a lot closer to see if the trauma in the body matches up with the holes in the clothing.
Each grave is full of everyday items. A wallet, a ring, even a set of dishes. Were they put there to comfort the dead or to tell the living who these people were in life? Dozens of minds gather at the site every day, just in case a friend or a family member is found.
The main difference from the work we do here to anywhere else is the presence of the community members in the entire process. People from the community are allowed to come into the grave as long as one of us is here.
The items found near the remains of the dead often provide solid clues that aid in the identification process. One such item played a critical role in a father finding the body of his son. At one of his gravesite excavations, Pecciarelli's assistant told him a Mayan man was coming every day, asking if anyone had found a belt buckle.
He asked me, should I go get him? And I said, sure, go get him. He ran off. And the old man came running, and he came right up to me. And he didn't say a word. I asked him, they tell me that you've been coming by every day and you're looking for a belt buckle. And I had the belt buckle, and I said, is this the belt buckle? And he didn't say anything. It must have been 30 seconds, but it felt like hours to me. And then eventually he just took a step back and opened his coat. And when I saw it was the same belt buckle. That was his son. It made me realize that there was something I could do to make a difference. Through my work, through something I like doing for other reasons. The way that anthropology is seen as an academic study of man. But when you start working in Guatemala, you realize it's a lot more than that. It's actually bringing lives back together. And, this old man hadn't seen his son in 20 years, and that belt buckle was his son. See this one?
Rios Montt slaughtered his potential enemies before they could fight back. The massacre of Panimache shows just how ruthless he was.
So that's a full set of baby teeth.
Yeah, first one was coming up. It hasn't been, maybe about 5 years old.
5 years old?
About 5 years old.
In the early 1980s, 1 in every 8 victims of a killing or disappearance was a child. The army may have believed children were the next generation of guerrilla fighters and had to be killed. The devastation of entire communities had drastic human consequences still felt today. The deaths of fathers and husbands left many of these impoverished families even poorer. Survivors continue to mourn the loss of family members, many of whom simply disappeared. The dig has been difficult and draining, but successful. Rios Mont's soldiers killed 35 people at Panimache. Pecciarelli's team found all but one. Workers on the site boxed the bones for later examination in Guatemala City. The team moves on to their next stop, a place, though even tinier than Panimache, saw even more bloodshed. The mountains of Guatemala. From a distance, they teem with life. But just below the surface, they are choked by death. 200,000 Guatemalans lie buried in a country no bigger than Tennessee. Freddie Pecciarelli and his team arrive at Chihulimul. As soon as they arrive, villagers tell them about that day in January. On January 23, 1981, Jose Rios Mont's thugs stormed in. By nightfall, 40 people were dead. Don Diego was a young man the day the soldiers came. He's been waiting 24 years for this morning. Diego says he went to the market with his brother and a few friends. They bought a loaf of bread and headed home. But the army was waiting. An ambush. Diego did the only thing he could. He ran. He knew if the soldiers caught him, they'd kill him. So he hid in the jungle. When he finally returned, he found his brother and his friends dead, like so many others in Chihulimul. The bodies had to be buried quickly in unmarked graves. Now Diego isn't sure where his brother is. He prays Murray and Suaz Navarre can find him so that he and his brother can have peace. The team talks to the villagers to try and pinpoint the exact location of the grave. They spend days digging in various sites, and finally, in one of the locations, they find a skeleton. A man. The bones tell Suaz Navarre and Murray how he died. He was surrounded by soldiers and could use only his hands to protect himself.
You can see this. Looks like a gunshot here.
Yeah, a defense wound where he
yes.
held his hand up and then the bullet went through his hand at that point.
Yes, I think so. Yes.
Another soldier shot him in the leg, shattering the left thigh bone. A bullet to the head finished the job.
So there's radiating fractures in the skull, but since we can't
the
see
left side here.
So someone may have been shooting from the left and he was trying to defend himself?
Yes, I think so. Yes.
Murray and Suaz Navarre can tell a lot from a set of bones, but not the one thing they most want to know. Who is this?
In Guatemala, especially among the Mayans, the challenges for identification are great. There are no medical records. There are no dental records.
So there's only one way to tell who this might have been. Find something he was wearing or carrying. His clothes say this man died in winter.
He has many clothes here. Several layers, and in January here is very cold. Préstame las tijeras otra vez. Okay.
Diego's brother was 42 when he was murdered, And the bones are from a man who was about 40 when he died. A man who knew what it meant to work hard.
And look, you see arthritis on his spine. Wasn't a young man, you can see see what I mean? The lipping, the arthritis here and here.
Yes, but look at this. Deformities, more typical here. Because they work with many.
Right, they put the loads on their back so it would not be uncommon to see arthritis in the spine.
Yes.
More digging. At last, a clue. It's a wallet. Only one thing can be made out. A calendar.
So here you can see 1979.
Yes. Yeah. It's a picture for Christmas time.
The soldiers came in January, so this could be Diego's brother. To be sure, the bones will be examined in Guatemala City. But even then, there are no guarantees.
Yeah. How do you spell that?
Soon, another body is found. Another man. But this one is younger. Perhaps his clothes may provide a clue to his identity. Anthropologist Raquel Lorenzana asks the crowd if anyone can identify the clothing.
A esta persona. ¿A los familiares? ¿Dónde están los familiares?
One old woman has brought every piece of clothing she owns. She has been waiting for this day for years.
16.
Nothing she carries matches anything found in the grave. Then, another wallet. This one is in good shape. In it is a single photograph. It is passed from hand to hand. Several minutes go by as the wallet is passed through the crowd. The villagers stare intently, hoping to recognize the person in the photo. Then, a trembling voice breaks the silence. A woman doesn't just recognize the picture, she knows the person in it. It is her brother, Pedro. He was only 16 the day the soldiers came to Chuhulimul. She remembers watching as they buried him on this spot. It's unusual to have the victim's family so close to a site, and it takes a toll on the anthropologists.
Exactly, especially when she's crying. It's difficult to see her.
But you're helping her, so I guess that's...
40 people died in this tiny village. Only 5 skeletons were found. Pedro Morales and maybe Don Diego's brother. But 35 people just like them will probably never be found. The find is always emotional for Pecciarelli and for the people looking on.
When you speak to the families of the people who were killed, they speak of their bodies being left out in the open or hidden as animals would be. They also speak of not being able to properly hold a burial or having any place to take flowers. So when we identify someone, it allows them this dignity, this human dignity.
Identifying skeletons that have been in unmarked graves for more than 20 years is as much art as science. At the lab in Guatemala City, Freddie Pecciarelli and his team will use both to bring the murderers to justice.
This is
200,000 Mayans lie in makeshift graves all over Guatemala. So far, Freddie Pecciarelli and his team have found 3,000 of them. All the remains are now being studied in this Guatemala City lab. Scientists study each individual bone in the hopes that they can uncover some small clue to point them to the murderers. The bones have to be cleaned, sorted, and categorized before they can be identified. And often, they need repair. Skulls are particularly fragile, especially after a quarter century in the ground. Many have to be glued together. The work is slow, but the team is committed to seeking justice for these murdered victims. Nothing will stop them, not even death threats. Pecciarelli gets letters telling him that unless he stops what he's doing, he'll die doing it. The phone rings in the middle of the night. Lab workers say cars follow them home. And some of the warnings aren't as subtle.
My garage door was shot at, and then they went after my family, sister, brother, etc. So, and that became more frustrating because we didn't know really where it was coming from or how much danger we were really in.
These scientists risk their lives to identify these victims for two reasons. So Mayans can finally bury their dead, and so no one in Guatemala will ever have to live in fear again. But figuring out who these people are isn't easy. The 21st century tools that most anthropologists take for granted don't work in Guatemala.
There are no dental records. There are no medical records in any of the communities.
So Pecciarelli and his team resort to inexact science. They interview a victim's friends and family and build what they call a before-death profile.
These interviews try to recreate the osteological profile of a person, how tall he was, or she was, the age. And then we compare those interviews with the analysis in the laboratory.
Then scientists match interview with evidence. If someone broke an arm as a child, they'll look for a skeleton with a healed fracture. Something as tiny as a chipped tooth can make an identification. And that identification of the dead allows the living to get on with their lives.
It is important to have them identified for legal reasons, not only for criminal prosecution, but also for inheritance purposes or for remarrial, for example. If somebody wants to get remarried, they can't because the person that they're married to is still alive in the legal records.
The bones can also tell Pecciarelli's team how someone died. Anthropologists Alejandro Santis and Elizabeth Murray examine a skull. Like so many others, this woman was shot in the back of the head.
Yeah, the people told us that the army went to the villages, and so the people got scared. So they ran out, and the army started to shoot them.
And you can see the fractures going out from where the bullet entered in the back of the skull. And then the injuries were so serious that it just blew the bones of the face, the small bones of the face were destroyed.
All exploded.
Destroyed that.
So we made sketches. This is, like all the fractures. Fractures we have in place. And also the neck. You could see it's also broken.
Yeah, even high up in her neck, the force of the impact to the back of the head was so serious it even broke bones in her neck.
Something as simple as a sweater can tell a horrifying tale to a trained eye.
Can you see here? We have some cut marks on the front too.
Scientist Claudia Rivera relives a man's nightmarish final minutes by comparing knife wounds on his ribs and vertebrae with cut marks in his sweater. He was stabbed 38 times.
Because it's from a double-bladed knife. The numbers are the number of times that the guy was stabbed on the back. And these cut marks match with the cut marks that we have on the bones. And I think that he was tied up because the position of some of them, the guy was, he couldn't move. He was tied up.
Identifying victims is tough. Building a case against the guilty can be almost impossible. So far, only a handful of these brutal cases have actually gone to trial.
The reason why that is can be explained in fear, maybe lack of interest a bit, and I'm sure in some cases not enough evidence.
But the team is making progress. In January 2004, the man believed to be behind the murders, Jose Rios Montt, lost his legal battle to avoid prosecution. The Guatemalan courts have stripped away his immunity. He can now be charged with overseeing the extermination of 200,000 Guatemalans. Justice may yet be served. Mayans believe the line between the living and the dead is a thin one. They also believe that a proper burial is an essential part of life. A Mayan wake is filled with ritual. There are songs, prayers, speeches, laughter, and tears. Before it ends, everyone in the village will take part. Jose Suas Navar knows these people have waited more than 20 years for this day. Many are too young to remember this lost generation, but they understand its importance. Here, the army troops came in and killed 20 villagers. Most were women and children and the elderly. The soldiers left the bodies out in the open as a warning to anyone thinking about collaborating with their enemies.
The survivors tried to bury them on the next day after the killing. But the army found out and came back into the village and made them take the bodies out of the grave they dug. But only 2 days later, after the army left, they hurried and buried them again in a secret place.
Suas Navar and other crew members unload the boxes containing the remains, delivering them to the members of the village. After the bones are unloaded and the men and women gather around their departed, Suas Navar begins.
You are brave people. You have courage to come forward and tell your stories, and to tell the stories of the people we remember here today. You're right to want their deaths investigated. That's the only way all this killing can stop once and for all. That's the only way your children will no longer have to live in fear like you did, like I did. We want them to live in peace.
The peace of an entire people begins here, with these 10 who will finally be laid to rest.
We were thrilled to finally be able to bring the bodies of these 10 people back to the village. We only wish we could have identified every body we found. Maybe one day we will find every Mayan who was killed and be able to tell who they were. But right now, it's just not possible. But we're always going to keep trying.
During this Mayan ritual, the survivors speak about their loved ones. This is the first time many of these reserved people have talked about what happened. At last, they are free, unloading a burden they've been carrying far too long.
Creo que esto es un día muy especial, pues, de que todas las familias podamos compartir este momento, este día, que es el último y único día, pues, que podemos compartir con nuestros familiares, nuestros difuntos. Entonces, yo creo que esto es muy importante.
This sacred ritual has a very worldly aspect. The prosecutor's office is here to record every death and issue death certificates. This will be vital in a trial. It will also let widows remarry and let children claim property that has been in limbo. Finally, each set of remains is placed in a casket. After more than 20 years, the bones of the dead can be laid to rest. As the children play outside, the villagers prepare to say goodbye. The floor is covered with fresh pine straw. The caskets are adorned with flowers. Then the burial begins. After one entire day and night of singing and praying, the bodies are finally buried. At last, these victims of one man's hunger for power can rest. And so can the living.
It's not a matter of getting the skeletons out of the ground. It's a matter of putting together the whole story of how those skeletons got in the ground in the first place, a history of the incident.
In the months and years ahead, the team hopes to bury tens of thousands more, including the boy with the belt buckle, Don Diego's brother, Pedro Morales, and all the others who died too soon and waited too long for this day. For Freddie Pecciarelli, this is more than a job. It's a calling. But there are too many bodies stretched out over too much territory.
We try to plan the next 5 years, and we realize that we need another 30 or 40 years of work at this level. I mean, we're conducting 70 to 80 investigations a year now. Massive. We're talking about recovering anywhere from 400 to 500 bodies every year, sometimes more. And at that level, we're still talking about 30 or 40 years of work.
The work is daunting. But for Pecciarelli, quitting is not an option.
We believe that you really can't build the future unless you know your past. By providing scientific proof of the atrocities that happened in Guatemala during the conflict, it has allowed us to show people what we see. It has allowed us to show people what the bones tell us.
Since 1992, Pecciarelli has prepared nearly 400 cases, but only 3 have gone to trial. The work is maddeningly slow, but Pecciarelli continues building his mountain of evidence. He hopes that soon it will speak for the thousands of silenced Guatemalans and bring their killers to justice.